It was a hot, sunny day, and a grandmother could be heard complaining that the heat was unbearable. Waving her fan, she wondered aloud what was taking Tyr's dad so long and told Tyr that they should wait just a little longer. Tyr, lying on the floor, quietly agreed with her grandmother. 10 nights had already passed, and Tyr's dad still had not come home. The cute little blonde girl lying there was Kim Astur, and her dad was an incredibly strong holy knight from the Talokium Empire. Tyr believed that every day her dad went out to punish evil monsters and villains across the empire. She had believed this completely until she turned 3, but now that she was 4 years old, she thought she was old enough to understand everything. If her dad was the strongest holy knight that everyone admired, then he should have been rich, yet Tyr's family was poor, and her dad worked every day, even on holidays. Tyr then asked another woman in the room why her dad had to work so much, and the woman explained that his job did not pay well compared to how dangerous and difficult it was. The two women felt pity for Tyr, while Tyr, quietly eating her food, wondered if this was the reason her dad could not buy her the new sticker book she wanted. She thought about how her friends from Quail class went to Tanapang World with their moms and dads every holiday, and sometimes to Latte World or even the beach. Her friends had told her that she should go too, and Tyr had wanted to, but she had never been to places like that with her dad. Still, Tyr told herself that it was fine. At that moment, Tyr, still lying on the floor, added that the adults at the Gold Villa apartments really liked both her and her dad. The grandmother gently patted Tyr's head and said to the other woman that if Tyr was not registered from birth, she wondered how the girl would ever be able to go to school. The other woman sighed and replied that it would be difficult to register her because Tyr was technically an illegal resident, and if the authorities discovered this, she would be deported back to her homeland. As the two elderly women shed tears, the black-haired woman added that if that happened, Tyr would be deported while her father would likely be sent to jail. The grandmother then said that they were fortunate that the kindergarten principal was a kind person, adding that Tyr might have grown up unable to learn anything if the principal had refused to accept her. Wanting to lighten the mood, the grandpa suddenly appeared and praised Tyr, saying she was incredibly smart and had even learned to read by herself. He added that he had never seen a child like Tyr in his entire life, and everyone in the room agreed, while Tyr simply felt happy being surrounded by them. Thinking back on her happy memories with her dad, Tyr said that she would live with him for a very long time, and that one day they would definitely return to their homeland, live in a bigger house, and eat lots of delicious food. She remembered how her dad used to carry her on his shoulders, and, with a warm smile, promised that he would make her laugh every single day. Tyr smiled at the memory because she loved her dad more than anything in the world. To her, her dad was 1,000 times more precious than any sticker book, so she quietly wished for him to come back home. With that same warm smile, Tyr hoped that her dad would return very soon. But Tyr's happiness did not last long, as the black-haired woman suddenly rushed into the house, shouting that something terrible had happened. The grandmother immediately scolded her for frightening everyone and asked what the commotion was about. The woman then handed her a note, and as soon as the grandmother read it, her face turned pale in shock, unable to believe what was written. As the adults quietly wondered what they should do, the grandmother told Tyr to stay where she was and remain quiet, promising that she would be right back. Tyr was left standing there alone, confused about what was happening. After a while, she overheard the elderly adults whispering about funerals, services, and regulations. Curious and uneasy, Tyr picked up the note they had left behind and began to read it. It was a notice of death for someone without family ties. At that moment, Tyr's knees grew weak and she collapsed to the floor. As she remembered the moments she had shared with her dad, she told herself that he would definitely come back because he had promised her he would. But when she saw the word deceased, she slowly realized that it meant someone had died. Outside, heavy rain began to pour, and Tyr wondered why her heart felt so anxious and heavy. Later, the grandmother returned home carrying a box filled with the belongings that had belonged to Tyr's dad. She placed the box down inside the house and gently asked Tyr if she had waited long. The grandmother then patted Tyr's head and said that Tyr would sleep with her again that night. As she spoke, the grandmother suddenly broke down in tears and hugged Tyr tightly, grieving over the cruel fate that had fallen upon the little girl. Tyr, however, quietly thought to herself that something felt strange. She had even used the sticker she saved, hoping it would bring her dad back, but he still had not returned. Remembering the happy memories she had shared with him, Tyr began to wonder if her dad had simply left her behind and gone somewhere far away. Later that night, while lying in bed beside her grandmother, Tyr suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She quietly got out of bed and walked over to the box to see what was inside. As she opened it, she found several items, and after looking at them, Tyr realized that they all belonged to her dad. At that moment, tears began to fall from her eyes. Holding a pendant in her small hands, Tyr remembered her dad telling her that he would live with her for a long time and that one day they would return to their homeland together. But now Tyr felt sad because her dad had left her behind. She began crying softly to herself, struggling to hold back her tears as she told herself that all she really needed was her dad. Unable to hold it in any longer, she suddenly started crying out loud. However, at that very moment, the pendant in her hand began to emit a bright light and slowly floated into the air, surprising Tyr. Then the pendant spoke and asked Tyr why she was crying. With tears still in her eyes, Tyr stared at it in disbelief and wondered how a stone could possibly be talking to her. Suddenly, the pendant transformed into a magical beast, and the creature once again asked Tyr why she was crying. Tyr was shocked to see the pendant change into such a creature, and she instinctively called out to it as Tanapang. The magical beast then calmly concluded that the man must have died, and hearing those words made Tyr burst into tears again, which caused the beast to grow slightly worried. As Tyr cried out for her dad, asking why he had left her all alone, the magical beast gently lowered its head and rested it on top of Tyr's head. In a soft voice, it asked the crying girl if she wanted it to go and save her dad. Tyr immediately opened her eyes in surprise when she heard that, and the magical beast asked her if she would stop crying if it went to save him. Tyr stood there in confusion while the magical beast calmly told her that if it were to do that, she would have to abandon all the time she had spent in this place. The familiar scenery, the people she knew, and everything in this room. Hearing this, Tyr thought to herself that from head to toe, her life would be pitch black without her dad. She did not fully understand what the magical beast was saying, but she knew that the most precious person in her life was her dad. The magical beast then told her that it would send her back to the place where she was born, the place where she truly belonged, and the place where her dad was still alive. As soon as Tyr heard those words, she wiped away her tears and immediately answered that she would go. She declared that she was going to save her dad and opened her arms wide, ready to leave the place where her dad was no longer alive. At that very moment, Tyr began to be teleported to another dimension. When the bright light finally faded, a beautiful scene appeared with a bed placed in the middle of the peaceful landscape. Tyr was lying on the bed, sleeping quietly. As the memories of what had just happened returned to her, Tyr slowly opened her eyes, still filled with tears, and called out for her dad. Sitting beside the bed was a young boy with cat-like ears, watching her closely. When he saw that she had opened her eyes, he asked if she was finally awake. Startled, Tyr suddenly jolted upright, surprised by the boy's presence, and like a frightened rabbit, she asked who he was. However, as Tyr looked more carefully, she noticed that his horns resembled the magical being she had spoken to earlier. Realizing this, Tyr excitedly called out the boy's name as Kamangpang and asked if he could transform into a person too, while the boy wondered when exactly he had gotten such a strange new name. Tyr quickly changed the topic and asked Kamangpang where they were, since this place looked nothing like the one she had been in before. The boy simply replied that they were here because Tyr had wanted to meet her dad. Tyr looked at the boy and asked if that was really true. The boy nodded and told her that this was her dad's homeland. He explained that the place was called Talokium and that it was a truly beautiful land, far bigger and better than the place where Tyr had lived before. Hearing this, Tyr looked around in awe as she gazed upon the homeland her father had always told her about. However, the boy soon added that even he could not bring Tyr's dad back to life. When Tyr heard those words, she froze for a moment. Confused, she asked Kamangpang what he meant. The boy then explained that instead of bringing her father back, he had brought Tyr herself back to the past, 7 years before she was born. Tyr became even more confused and asked how that was possible, wondering how she could be standing there if she had not even been born yet. Then something suddenly clicked in her mind. Tyr began trying to reason it out, thinking that going back to the past must mean going back to yesterday, and before that meant going back from 4-year-old Tyr to 3-year-old Tyr, and then to 2-year-old Tyr. From that strange logic, she excitedly concluded that she had somehow traveled back in time. With sparkling eyes, Tyr told Kamangpang that this must be the legendary magic that Puppetmon used, adding that he was really amazing. The boy, however, looked annoyed at being called such a strange and unfamiliar name. Deciding to ignore it, he explained that he had used his power to its absolute limit, even touching different dimensions in order to travel all the way back to this point in time. But while he was doing that, Tyr had suddenly fallen asleep, so he had to create a place for her to rest. As he said this, the boy paused and wondered why he was even bothering to explain all of it. Shaking off the thought, he changed the topic and told Tyr that the most important thing was that her dad was definitely alive in this world. Hearing that, Tyr's eyes lit up with excitement. However, there was a twist. Turning back into his beast form, the boy explained that the father living in this time would not know who Tyr was. He also told her that this world was much bigger than she imagined, and there was no guarantee that she would even be able to meet him. Hearing this, Tyr's eyes quickly filled with tears again. But after a moment, she looked up with determination and said that she could find him. She added that it was fine even if her dad did not recognize her, because as long as they met again, she could explain everything to him. Despite the uncertainty, Tyr felt a bright sense of hope knowing that her dad was still alive in this world. Wiping away her tears, she remembered that her dad had once told her that he was incredibly strong, the strongest holy knight. She also recalled that the place where those holy knights gathered was called the Order. Holding Kamangpang in her arms, Tyr confidently told him that it was possible for them to find her dad and that they would head to the Order. Sometime later, in the southern region of the Talokium Order, within Breowood Forest, a large bearded man sat eating his food while complaining that it did not taste very good. The man's name was Basto Ferrix, a wandering mercenary. As he ate, Basto grumbled that his traps were no longer working because all the animals in the area had disappeared, driven away by the monsters emerging from the magic stones. Taking out his map, Basto examined it carefully and confirmed that whenever he attacked one magic stone, monsters would appear from another. If he attacked that one too, yet another stone would appear nearby. He sighed and muttered that monsters had been pouring out endlessly ever since those strange magic stones had appeared. Thinking back to the events of the previous day, Basto recalled how he had been certain he would die during the chaos. Yet somehow he had managed to survive once again. Letting out a small chuckle, he shook his head and muttered that everything felt completely pointless. As Basto was recalling his past, he suddenly heard a voice nearby. Instantly grabbing his weapon, he became alert and wondered if something had been caught in one of his traps. Meanwhile, Tyr was breathing heavily as she struggled to move forward. Thinking to herself that this was bad, she wondered why she could not go any farther. Looking up at the birds flying through the sky, Tyr thought that if she had wings, she could simply whoosh straight to the Order. With that thought in mind, she called out to Kamangpang. However, Kamangpang immediately understood what she was thinking and told her that he could not carry her, so she should not even consider such an idea. Tyr was surprised that Kamangpang could read her mind, but the boy quickly added that his name was not Kamangpang in the first place. Hearing that, Tyr began wondering if Kamangpang might actually be the legendary Puppetmon instead. The boy sighed and explained that he could not do much at the moment because he had already used up all of his power. Hearing this, Tyr thought to herself that Kamangpang must have spent all his strength granting her wish. So she decided that she should not keep making demands without showing gratitude. With that in mind, Tyr walked over to him and kindly offered to give him a free massage, proudly believing she was very good at it. The boy, however, looked troubled by her persistence. Grabbing his wings, he quickly told her that he was completely fine and did not need a massage. He then explained that even if he still had power left, magic that left traces, such as teleportation, could allow others to track them, so he could not risk using it. At that moment, after saying those words, the boy suddenly reverted back into his pendant form, and the pendant dropped to the ground. Tyr looked worried and quickly called out to Kamangpang as she saw that he had turned back into the pendant. Picking it up and staring at it closely, Tyr concluded that since Kamangpang was the legendary Puppetmon, he must have returned to his puppet ball to rest. Carefully placing the pendant inside her bag, she softly told Kamangpang not to worry and that she would reach the Order on her own. With a small spark of motivation, Tyr began walking forward again, telling Kamangpang to trust her. However, only a few seconds later, she unknowingly stepped straight toward a trap. By the time Tyr realized it, it was already too late. The trap had sprung, and she was caught. Basto suddenly appeared from nearby, looking alert and determined. Tyr, trapped and unable to move, became extremely frightened when she saw the strange man standing in front of her. With tears filling her eyes, she called out to Kamangpang inside her bag, saying that she was in trouble. Panicking, Tyr tried to calm herself down and repeatedly told herself that everything would be fine. Then, In her panic, she even told the strange man not to cry. The man, completely confused, could not understand what was going on as Tyr continued hiccuping between her sobs. Basto stared at the strange scene in disbelief. In a forest where monsters roamed freely at night, a small child was somehow wandering around alone, had gotten caught in his trap, and was now trying to reassure him instead. Still panicking, Tyr told the strange man that everything was fine and insisted that her dad was nearby, so she told him to go away. Hearing that, Basto felt slightly relieved, thinking that the child's father must be somewhere close. However, he then spoke gently and told her that her dad would be very shocked if he saw his child in such a situation. He asked her to stay still so that he could untie her. As Basto worked to free her from the trap, Tyr continued screaming in panic and called out Kamangpang's name again and again, begging him to come save her. Basto tried to comfort her, telling her that it was okay to cry and that if she cried loudly enough, her dad might hear her and come find her soon. Through her tears, Tyr kept repeating that she had a dad, saying it over and over again. Basto looked troubled but gently told her that he believed her, even though he noticed that the more she talked about her dad, the harder she cried. After finishing untying the trap, Basto told the child that she was free now and could go to her dad. Tyr slowly stood up, still crying, and nervously asked the strange man if he was not going to catch her. Basto looked confused and asked why he would catch her. Tyr then explained that she thought he was a kidnapper, which was why she had asked. Hearing this, Basto froze in shock and quickly realized that the child had been crying because she was scared of how he looked. Letting out a tired sigh, Basto explained that he did not kidnap people and that the trap was not meant for her at all. It had been set for rabbits. Tyr looked surprised when she heard that. Basto then placed his weapon on the ground to show that he meant no harm and told the child that he would step back so she would not feel afraid. He urged her to hurry and return to her dad, explaining that the forest was too dangerous for a small child to wander around alone. Hearing this, Tyr nodded and began walking away. As she started to run, Basto watched her go and quietly wondered if he should follow her from a distance until she found her parents, since he was worried about her safety. However, Tyr had barely taken a few steps before she suddenly tripped and fell flat on the ground. Basto stared in surprise, realizing that the child had fallen after only 3 steps. Tyr began crying again as blood started to appear on her leg. Pointing at the injury, she called out to the man and showed him where she was hurt. Seeing this, Basto immediately stepped in to help. A few moments later, he was carefully wrapping Tyr's injured leg with a bandage. While he was treating the wound, Tyr curiously asked the man if rabbits tasted good. Basto replied that they did. Tyr then asked what they tasted like, and Basto casually answered that, to him, all meat tasted pretty much the same. Tyr quickly disagreed and said that pigs, cows, and chickens all tasted different. Listening to her speak so confidently about food made Basto wonder if the child might actually come from a noble family. As he thought about it more carefully, he also realized that earlier the child had been crying loudly, yet no one had appeared, even though she had claimed that her father was nearby. Clearly, that did not seem to be the case. Because of this, Basto decided to ask her directly and told the child to be honest about where her dad really was. Tyr looked worried for a moment, but eventually spoke up and explained that her dad was actually at a place called the Order. Hearing that, Basto was surprised because the Order was at least 5 days away from this forest. Even though the Briowood Forest was relatively close compared to other regions, it was still far too great a distance for a small child to travel alone. Basto then reminded Tyr that she had said earlier that her dad was nearby. Looking troubled, Tyr tried to explain that her teacher had told her never to beg for help if she was kidnapped. Instead, she said that the proper way to deal with a kidnapper was not to provoke them, but to calmly negotiate. She even began explaining this lesson to Basto, telling him that if he were ever kidnapped, he should follow the same advice. Basto found the idea rather pointless, since if he were kidnapped, he would probably just beat up the kidnappers instead. Listening to her explanation, Basto concluded that the child must have attended some kind of class that taught safety protocols for dealing with kidnappers. However, regardless of whether her story was completely true or not, judging by her appearance and the way she spoke, it was obvious that Tyr had grown up in a loving and well-off household. Basto could not help but think that if her parents knew that a child like her was wandering alone in such a dangerous forest, they would be worried out of their minds. Basto then spoke up and told Tyr that he would take her to the Order. Tyr looked surprised when she heard the man say that. With a warm smile, Basto added that her dad must be waiting for her very much. As he said this, he handed her a bowl of soup. Tyr took the bowl and gently blew on it to cool it down, agreeing with what the man had said. As he sipped his own soup, Basto explained that he was heading to the Order anyway to report about the magic stone he had attacked the day before. While they were eating, Tyr noticed that the soup contained carrots. Seeing them made her hesitate for a moment, but Basto encouraged her to eat so she would have the energy to meet her dad. Hearing that, Tyr thought that the man was right. If she stayed picky about food, she could never become a strong kid, so even if she did not like it, she would endure it and eat it anyway. However, the moment she finally drank the soup, something unexpected happened. Tyr's eyes lit up as she exclaimed that the soup was delicious and that the carrots were soft and sweet, almost like jelly. Basto chuckled and offered her another bowl, which Tyr happily accepted. As she held the bowl, Tyr suddenly noticed some writing on it that said, "Daddy, I love you." She was surprised that she could read the letters, because they were not Korean characters. When she thought about it more carefully, she realized that the man was not even speaking her language either. Because of that, Tyr concluded that it must have been Kamangpang's doing, and she happily muttered that Kamangpang really was amazing. Hugging her bag where the pendant rested, Tyr said that if Kamangpang were awake, he would be able to eat with them and regain his strength too. Looking up at the sky, she quietly added that she wanted to see both her dad and Kamangpang again soon. Later that night, as she prepared to sleep, Tyr thought to herself that when she arrived at the Order, she would go meet her dad right away, and that Kamangpang and the Mister would greet him too. The next day, Basto carried Tyr in his arms as they continued their journey toward the Order. Along the way, Tyr happily talked about how they would eat delicious food together, grow into strong people, and when they finally met her dad, she would proudly tell him that she had worked really hard. 4 days later, at the outskirts of the Order near the first gate, Basto arrived while carrying Tyr in his arms. However, he was surprised when the guard stopped him and told him that he could not enter. Confused and irritated, Basto asked what this was supposed to mean. One of the guards calmly replied that Basto Ferrick's mercenary identification number had been terminated, and because of that, they could not allow him to pass through the gate. Hearing this, Basto's expression turned furious as the guard firmly told him to turn back. Tyr, who was in his arms, was also surprised by what she heard. A short while later, outside the first gate at the Gate Inn, an angry voice could be heard shouting curses. Basto, still furious, insisted that Carl Warben must have been the one behind this. At that moment, the proprietress of the Gate Inn, who was holding Tyr in one arm and a bowl of clean water in the other, shouted at Basto not to destroy her inn with his temper and told him to go show his strength somewhere else. She then began cleaning Tyr up while asking Basto what he had done to the child for her to end up so dirty. As the woman gently wiped her face and hands, Tyr was reminded of how her grandmother used to take care of her in the same way. Meanwhile, the proprietor of the Gate Inn asked Basto again if it was really true that his mercenary identification number had been terminated. Looking troubled, Basto replied that the Holy Knights must have been bribed because there was no way an identification number that had been perfectly valid just 2 weeks ago could suddenly be terminated like that. Earlier, Basto had confronted the guard and angrily asked if he even knew what Basto had been doing and where he had just come from. As he stepped closer, the guard grew tense while Basto demanded an explanation. Basto then declared that the 3 magic stones on the outskirts of the Order had been causing major trouble for the Imperial family, and that he had personally attacked one of the stones in Breowood Forest before coming here to report it. However, the guard responded with a cold, mocking smile and told Basto that the small magic stone in Breowood had already been dealt with cleanly and efficiently. According to the official report, it had been destroyed by the Death Hound mercenary group. Hearing this, Basto was completely stunned. The guard then accused Basto of trying to steal someone else's credit, adding that he had heard rumors of such behavior before but had not expected it from Basto Ferrix. The other guards joined in, openly shaming Basto for allegedly claiming someone else's achievements and even trying to deceive the Knights of the Order. One of them warned him to leave quietly or they would be forced to expel him by force. Basto's anger boiled over as he realized that this was undoubtedly Carl Werben's doing. Remembering the false promises Carl had made to him before, Basto felt his rage burning hotter with every passing second. The guards, seeing the fury in Basto's eyes, began to feel uneasy about the situation they had provoked. However, at that moment, Tyr gently placed her small hand on Basto's face and asked him in a soft, caring voice if he was okay. Seeing her worried expression helped calm Basto down. Meanwhile, Tyr, who was on the verge of crying again, thought to herself that even though the Mister had a scary face, he somehow looked very sad. Basto let out a long sigh and apologized to Tyr, explaining that it might take a little longer for them to reach the order. Tyr simply nodded and replied that it was okay. As Basto walked away, the guards muttered among themselves that he was a crazy man, with one of them saying he could sense that Basto had been on the verge of killing someone. Another guard wondered what the leader of the Deathhound mercenary group was even thinking by associating with a man like Basto. Meanwhile, Basto walked away in silence, thinking to himself that the first thing he needed to do was find a place to stay for a while. After that, he would figure out what was really going on and find a way to enter the order. He could not understand why they were suddenly blocking the gates and prohibiting civilians from entering. Outside the order, countless refugees had already gathered, people who had lost their homes because of the magic stones. As Basto continued complaining about the situation, the proprietor of the inn interrupted him and told him that he had said enough. At the same time, the proprietress gently pinched Tyr's cute cheeks and cheerfully announced that she was finally clean. The proprietor then advised Basto to control his anger if he wanted to stay safe. Basto admitted that he was simply frustrated. Tyr, watching quietly, noticed that the mister had that same sad expression on his face again. The proprietor then added that he understood why Basto felt that way and said he was sorry about what had happened to Bastos Banera village. When Tyr heard this, something suddenly clicked in her mind. She curiously asked if they were talking about bananas. Both Basto and the proprietor looked confused, wondering what she meant. When Tyr repeated the word banana, the proprietor slowly realized that she might be referring to Banera village. Tyr quickly nodded in agreement. With a bit of cream still on her lips, she wondered why she had only remembered this now and said that Banana village was Mr. Bastos' village. Hearing this, Basto confirmed that Tyr was right. Then, with a bright and excited expression, Tyr happily added that she also knew Mr. Basto. At that moment, Tyr remembered something her dad had once told her. He had said that he used to have 20 subordinates, and that instead of having 100 weak people, it was much better to have 20 extremely strong ones. Tyr had curiously asked if all of her dad's subordinates were legendary Puppetmon, and her dad laughed and replied that they were all very strong. Among them, he said the person closest to him was someone Tyr knew as Hammer Mister. Originally, Hammer Mister had not been her dad's subordinate at all. He had actually been the vice captain of a mercenary group called the Death Hound. Tyr, confused by the name, had asked what hound meant. Her father explained that Death Hound basically meant dogs of death, which frightened Tyr a little when she heard it. Her dad then continued, explaining that the mercenary group was based in Banera village and that the leader of the group was a man named Carl. According to him, Carl constantly made Hammer Mister work extremely hard. As Tyr remembered this conversation, she slowly realized something while looking at Basto's face. The Hammer Mister her dad had talked about was none other than Mr. Basto. Tyr also recalled her dad saying that they had once been friends, but Carl had eventually betrayed Mr. Basto and ran away on his own. Her father had explained that Carl used to spend his time idly in Banera village while constantly ordering Hammer Mister to attack magic stones every single day. Despite that, Hammer Mister had never refused even once, because Carl had promised that while he was away, he would take good care of Basto's wife and daughter. However, one terrible day, disaster struck Banera village. That day was known as the Day of Destruction, a rare and terrifying event when monsters that normally could only move at night were suddenly able to roam freely during the daytime. Tyr's father had warned her that if they ever returned there, she must remember that it would be very dangerous. He then continued the story, explaining that at the exact time when the disaster occurred, Hammer Mister had been away from the village, attacking another magic stone. In that desperate moment, the terrified villagers rushed to Carl, pleading with him to summon the mercenaries as danger closed in on their village. Carl, still heavily drunk, lazily assured them that everything would be handled, telling them to remain calm in their homes while he supposedly went to inspect the situation and arrange their evacuation. Instead of fulfilling his duty, he slipped away under the guise of checking the surroundings and fled without looking back. Trusting his words, the villagers waited helplessly, only for monsters to descend upon the village and slaughter every last one of them. By the time Hammer Mister returned, the village had been reduced to silence, and among the dead were his own wife and daughter. Tyr's father continued the story, explaining that after this tragedy, Hammer Mister abandoned the Death Hound group and the coward Carl, who later tried to silence him by bribing the Holy Knights to erase his identification card when Hammer Mister refused to follow him any longer. Tyr realized the story matched what her father had once told her, and now Carl had also erased the number that allowed Mr. Basto access to the order. The tale continued with how the grieving Hammer Mister, wandering alone, eventually crossed paths with Tyr's father, who at that time held the rank of number 1. Seeing immediately that Hammer Mister possessed both strength and kindness, Tyr's father created a new identification card for him and invited him to travel alongside him. The memories returned clearly to Tyr, and with them came a firm resolve to find her father as quickly as possible, believing he alone could help Mr. Basto. While determination filled her thoughts, someone beside her casually wiped the cream from her mouth. Yet the problem remained that reaching her father required going to the order, a place she currently had no way of reaching. And as the thoughts tangled together in her mind while she searched for a solution to save Mr. Basto, the strain of thinking so intensely began to make her head ache. Later that night, Tyr lay asleep on her bed. Yet even in her rest, her wrinkled forehead revealed the worries that still troubled her mind. Seeing this, Basto quietly approached and gently pulled the blanket over her to keep her warm. As he stood there looking at the sleeping girl, his thoughts wandered to the problem that now burdened them, wondering whether it might somehow be possible to create a new mercenary identification number or discover another way for her to enter the order. Even if he himself could not accompany Tyr, he believed the least he could do was find someone trustworthy and ensure that the child safely reached the order. A faint smile appeared on his face as he accepted that their encounter had been brief and that the time for them to part ways was approaching. And with those thoughts settled in his mind, he eventually returned to his own rest. Nearby, the boy had already returned to his dragon form, his small head peeking out from inside the bag as he quietly observed Tyr's peaceful sleeping face, which looked as though nothing troubling had ever happened. Slipping out of the bag, he admitted to himself that he had been worried, yet he also felt surprised that Tyr had truly managed to travel all the way here on her own. Though he wished he could remain with her a little longer, his strength had not yet fully recovered, and the mere act of turning back time, slightly, had already left him in such a weakened state that he could only feel frustrated at his own helplessness. Hoping she would wait a little longer, he finally transformed back into the pendant once more. The following morning arrived quietly, and Tyr was soon seen walking down the stairs after just getting out of bed. Curious about Bastos' whereabouts, she asked the proprietress about him, only to learn that he had already gone out early that morning. The old woman then kindly suggested that if Tyr felt bored, she could accompany her on a shopping trip, an offer that Tyr accepted with bright enthusiasm. A short while later, the busy market was overflowing with people, its streets filled with noise and movement as merchants and refugees crowded the narrow paths. Amid the chaos, a loud voice ordered the refugees to move aside and clear the way. As Tyr looked around, she noticed the tired faces of the displaced people, and the old woman beside her explained that the situation had grown even worse after the sudden appearance of the magic stones. Tyr's eyes soon fell upon a child around her own age who was also among the refugees, and the sight stirred her thoughts. She remembered Bastos' words and felt that he had been right, realizing how strange it was that the order had blocked its gates and forbidden civilians from entering, while so many people had already lost their homes because of the magic stones. It seemed to her that nearly everyone outside the order lived in hardship like this, while only the wealthy inside remained protected. Just then, a loud commotion erupted when a plump old man angrily accused one of the refugees of stealing his wallet. The startled woman insisted she had done nothing wrong and explained that she had merely bumped into him by accident. The man, already furious, lashed out and struck her across the face, the sharp sound echoing through the crowded market. Tyr watched in shock at the sudden violence, and with her small voice, she tried to tell the man that hitting people was wrong. The scene reminded her of the place where she used to live, where the woman from room 203 had often been beaten by a cruel man. Despite the pain she endured, that kind woman had always greeted Tyr with a warm smile, sometimes offering her ice cream, and even taking the time to teach her things. Remembering that kindness now filled Tyr with anger, her cheeks puffing slightly as she stepped forward with determination. Believing firmly that people who hurt others were bad, she bravely placed herself between the man and the woman, insisting that he stop and that hurting others was wrong. Meanwhile, the grandmother suddenly realized that Tyr had vanished from her side and looked around in surprise. The enraged man glared down at the small figure blocking him and demanded to know who the troublesome child was. But before the situation could escalate further, several people nearby stepped forward and spoke up in defense of the refugee, insisting that she had stolen nothing and urging the man to stop causing trouble. The fat man angrily declared that the people around him clearly had no idea who he was and were daring to challenge someone of his standing. Before he could continue, the grandmother calmly stepped forward and positioned herself between him and the others, urging him to think carefully about where he was standing. She reminded him that the back alleys near the checkpoint were places where desperate people gathered, individuals who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. Confused by her warning, the man demanded to know what she meant, but the old woman responded with a cold, menacing gaze. She explained that whether he was a noble or a wealthy man meant nothing in this place, and quietly advised him that if he wished to avoid being discovered as an unrecognizable corpse abandoned on a dark roadside one night, it would be wiser for him to leave without making any further trouble. Around them, several of the onlookers began staring at the man with equally threatening expressions, silently reinforcing her warning. Realizing that the situation had quickly turned against him, the man decided that retreating for now would be the safest option and reluctantly backed away. Watching this unfold, Tyr could not help but admire how impressive the grandmother had been, while the woman who had been struck earlier still remained sitting silently on the ground. The grandmother then turned her attention to the injured woman and asked if she was the one who had been staying in the room at the far end of the second floor. Slowly standing up, the woman faced her as the old lady mentioned that she had noticed she had not come around for several days and wondered what had brought her to the market today. Instead of answering politely, the woman curtly told the grandmother to mind her own business, which surprised Tyr greatly. The grandmother, however, showed no intention of backing down and bluntly remarked that the woman was being quite rude, asking if she had even seen the state of her own face. When the woman glanced at a nearby mirror and noticed the swelling and injury left by the slap, the old lady calmly told her to come along with them. Meanwhile, Tyr began quietly questioning herself, uncertain whether she had truly helped a kind person or if the situation might have been something entirely different. The woman suddenly turned her gaze toward Tyr with a frightening expression, and the intensity of it made the young girl instinctively shrink back in fear. Sometime later, they returned to the inn, where the grandmother calmly told Tyr to prepare herself for a meal while also handing the injured woman a towel and instructing her to clean her face. The woman insisted that she was perfectly fine and did not need it, but the grandmother bluntly asked if she should simply throw the towel at her face instead. Left with little choice, the woman reluctantly began wiping away the dirt and marks from the earlier confrontation. Tyr watched the scene nervously, still intimidated by the woman's presence, and quietly thought to herself that she had been wondering about it for a while, but the woman seemed rather mean. Lost in her thoughts, Tyr accidentally muttered the word out loud while staring at her. The woman immediately demanded that Tyr repeat what she had just said, causing Tyr to nervously ask whether she had really stolen the wallet after all. With an innocent and slightly pouty expression, Tyr added that if someone was mean, a tiger might come and carry them away. The comment instantly angered the woman, who burst out in frustration and demanded to know who Tyr was calling a woman before suddenly pulling back the hood covering her head. To Tyr's complete surprise, the person revealed beneath it was actually a handsome boy rather than a woman, a revelation that completely overturned what everyone had assumed until that moment. After firmly confirming once again that he was indeed a boy, Tyr immediately corrected herself, switching from calling him Uni to calling him Appa instead. Fascinated by the unexpected discovery, Tyr excitedly remarked that it was her first time seeing an Appa who looked so much like an Uni, leaving her completely captivated. Just then, Basto returned and pushed open the door, and the boy spoke up while holding a wallet in his hand. He admitted that he had taken the wallet earlier, though he clarified that it had originally belonged to him, making it more accurate to say that he had simply taken it back. The boy then explained that the fat man had once hired him to help locate members of a mercenary group, but after the job was finished, the man kept the payment for himself and tried to run off, something the boy had no intention of allowing to happen. Both Tyr and Basto were taken aback by the boy's blunt admission. He went on to explain that someone like him had no chance of receiving a knight's appointment, and if he wanted to earn money by hunting monsters, becoming a mercenary was the only path available to him. Hearing this, Tyr's eyes lit up with sudden determination, and she eagerly asked whether forming a mercenary group would allow them to obtain an identification card. The boy confirmed that it was possible, though he pointed out that they would first have to pass the mercenary examination. At that moment, it felt as if a light bulb had appeared above Tyr's head as a new idea formed in her mind. With an excited and resolute expression, she boldly suggested that they should form a mercenary group together. The boy stared at her in disbelief and asked what she was even talking about, reminding her that what he needed was a capable partner to earn money with, not a child tagging along. His raised voice made Tyr shrink back slightly in fear. Leaning forward, he poked her head and explained that he was an assassin, making it completely unreasonable for someone in his profession to team up with a kid. Tyr quickly defended her idea by claiming she had a legendary puppetmon on her side, referring proudly to the boy who currently existed as a pendant. The assassin paused in confusion, wondering what exactly a puppetmon was supposed to be. Tyr then added that Mr. Basto was also incredibly strong, prompting the boy to ask who this Mr. Basto even was. At that exact moment, Basto stepped forward into view, startling the boy while filling Tyr with happiness at seeing Hammer Mr. Basto again. Basto calmly introduced himself with his full name, Basto Ferrix, before shifting the conversation by asking whether the boy truly intended to form a mercenary group. The boy looked at him suspiciously, silently wondering who this bulky stranger was, while Basto casually claimed that he could handle small magic stones by himself. Lifting Tyr into his arms, he then explained that although he had recently lost his mercenary identification number, he had once been a mercenary in the past. Basto calmly explained that 6 days earlier he had personally attacked the small magic stone in Brio Wood on his own, while Tyr continued eagerly urging the boy to join them in forming a mercenary group. Hearing this claim caused the boy to recall an incident from a few days before, when Carl had been standing proudly before a crowd, loudly boasting that the immortal Death Hound had returned after successfully attacking a small magic stone. At the time, the boy had felt irritated by Carl's arrogant behavior and the way he shamelessly bragged about the achievement. What had bothered him even more was how easily Carl had been allowed through the checkpoint guards without any proper inspection, especially when core stones, proof of defeating monsters, were supposed to be checked carefully. The boy clearly remembered that the mercenary group Carl mentioned had supposedly attacked a small magic stone, yet as far as he knew, there had only been one such magic stone in Brio Wood. Returning to the present, the boy looked at Basto with suspicion and bluntly accused him of lying, insisting that he had already heard about the mercenaries who claimed to have destroyed that magic stone. Tyr quickly spoke up in defense, firmly insisting that the story was wrong and that Hammer Mister had actually done everything himself, while Carl had stolen the credit. She also revealed that Carl had been the one responsible for making Hammer Mister's identification number disappear, leaving him in his current difficult situation. Basto responded calmly, saying it did not truly matter whether the boy believed him or not, because he could easily prove the truth. For now, all he needed was to recover his identification number so he could enter the order. He then explained that the child chemister's father was currently at the order and that he had promised to bring her there safely. Hearing this, the boy paused in confusion for a moment before finally realizing that the towering man beside him was not actually the little girl's father, something he felt he should have noticed earlier since the two of them did not resemble each other in the slightest. The boy silently studied the pair before him and began thinking the situation through, eventually deciding that they did not appear to be lying. In his eyes, the little brat seemed far too simple-minded to fabricate a convincing story, while the muscle-headed man standing beside her looked equally incapable of pulling off a clever lie. With that thought, the pieces began to make sense in his mind. The mercenary group that had claimed the achievement now seemed suspicious, and it became easy to imagine that they had stolen the man's accomplishment and, fearing retaliation afterward, arranged for his mercenary identification number to be erased so he would not even be able to approach the order. The boy reflected on his own situation as well, recalling how he had already spent 2 entire months lingering near the gate in search of competent people to work with, yet no one suitable had appeared. In the end, he had been forced to accept a request out of desperation, only to be betrayed for his trouble. The thought of becoming comrades with unreliable half-trained fighters and possibly dying during the mercenary examination was something he refused to accept, yet wasting even more time when he could be earning money was equally unacceptable to him, especially since something important was waiting for him. Finding himself cornered by circumstance, the boy, whose name was finally revealed to be Vale Theodore, slammed his hand onto the table and called out to Basto, declaring that if Basto failed to prove his worth, he would not hesitate to abandon him without a second thought. Basto responded calmly, remarking that it was better to run away early than become useless baggage, and bluntly advised Vale not to end up being the burden instead. The remark immediately irritated Vale, while Tyr watched the exchange in confusion, quietly wondering whether this meant the mercenary group had already been formed. The following day arrived with Tyr happily marching along the street while holding the hands of both Basto and Vale. As they walked together, Vale could not help wondering why he had somehow ended up being forced to hold the child's hand. Tyr, however, was overflowing with excitement, happily praising Hammer Mr. Strength while also admiring how strong and handsome her new Appa looked, leaving Vale puzzled about why she seemed so thrilled by the situation. Tyr continued excitedly listing her accomplishments, proudly explaining that Kamang was a legendary puppetmon and that she herself had once taken first place in Quail class training. She eagerly went on about how skilled she was at games like hide-and-seek, tag, and cops and robbers, boasting that whenever she was the one chasing, she could always catch everyone without fail. Gripping a small stick like a weapon, she confidently declared that catching monsters would not be any different and that she would simply catch them all as well. Calling out to the two adults beside her, Tyr insisted that they had nothing to worry about because she was incredibly strong. However, before her enthusiasm could go any further, Basto gently placed a hand on her shoulders and firmly told her that she would not be catching any monsters. The statement caught Tyr completely off guard, leaving her surprised. Realizing she had little understanding of what monsters were actually like, Basto explained that dealing with them was far from child's play and asked her what kind of thing she feared the most. Tyr thought for a moment before answering that the scariest creature she could imagine was a T-Rex. Basto admitted he had no idea what a T-Rex was, but he calmly stated that real monsters were far more terrifying, perhaps 10 times worse than whatever she was imagining. Hearing this immediately made Tyr tremble with fear, and the small stick she had been holding slipped from her hand and fell to the ground. Seeing this reaction, Basto explained that he had already arranged for someone to watch over her. At that moment, an elderly man appeared nearby, a fortune teller named Nordic's Omen. Basto instructed Tyr to stay here quietly with the old man for a while, and she obediently agreed. He then informed the fortune teller that they would return before dawn, to which the old man casually replied that he had received an introduction from Jax, the proprietor of the gate and where Vale had been staying. Tyr felt a wave of disappointment as she realized how nervous she had become, remembering that her father had once warned her about monsters as well. She recalled how he had explained that there were many different kinds of monsters and countless ways they could attack, reminding her to never lower her guard no matter the situation. Thinking about those words, Tyr quietly told herself that she should not behave immaturely, and although she still felt a little down, she bravely assured the two that she would stay behind and wait quietly. Vale nodded at that and casually told her that she should do exactly that, adding that she better not start crying while they were gone. Tyr immediately insisted that she would never cry and proudly declared that she was not a little kid anymore, but Vale dismissed her claim and bluntly told her that she was still a little kid. He went on to tease her by recalling how he had heard her crying loudly the first time she met Basto, with tears running down her face and snot hanging from her nose as she begged to be saved. Embarrassed and furious at the reminder, Tyr argued back that she might be a child, but she was not a little kid. Vale only mocked her further, saying there was no real difference between the two, while Tyr stubbornly insisted that Vale Appa was completely wrong. Before their argument could escalate any further, Basto stepped in and calmly told Vale that it was enough. Tyr then turned toward Basto and politely wished him goodbye, and he responded with a warm and reassuring smile. Vale, however, immediately became irritated that Tyr had not said anything to him. Pouting slightly, Tyr quickly added that Vale Appa should also be careful, which instantly pleased him. Amused, he remarked that Tyr was quite a funny child, admitting that he had never expected to see a little kid who wanted to attack a magic stone. Basto then casually suggested that Tyr might actually be the child of a noble family, prompting Vale to question why a noble's child would ever be wandering alone in a forest. Basto admitted that it was only speculation on his part, yet added that whether Vale believed it or not did not change the fact that when he had asked the girl about her parents, the name she gave had left him completely stunned. Sometime later, the two arrived at Tenebrum Cave, a place where newly sprouted small magic stones had begun turning the area into a nest for monsters. As they carefully moved through the dark tunnels, Vale carried a lantern and casually asked Basto how a name could possibly be strange enough to leave him so baffled. Basto explained that the name Tyr had given him followed a format he had never heard before, recalling that she had introduced herself with the surname Kim and the name Youngsu. Hearing that only made Vale more confused, and he remarked that such a name did not sound like anything that could belong to a noble family. He reasoned that even if the girl had become lost somewhere, that was still the name she had provided, and he questioned whether Basto could realistically find her father with such vague information. Internally, Vale could not help thinking that everything about these two seemed rather strange. After all, he had purchased information from the black market the previous day and learned that Basto had once lost his family in Banera village before becoming a wandering mercenary. Before that tragedy, however, Basto had served as the vice captain of the Death Hound group and was known for possessing exceptional combat skills. Vale admitted to himself that while the loss of Basto's family was certainly unfortunate, if those rumored abilities were truly real, then working with him could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. As they continued deeper into the cave, Vale observed how the tunnels twisted and branched until the place began to resemble a maze. Basto explained that small magic stones had begun sprouting inside different chambers scattered throughout the cave, and since the distance between them was fairly large, their plan was to destroy the one closest to the entrance and withdraw immediately afterward. Vale agreed, declaring that he would give it everything he had, and Basto responded in kind while preparing his weapon. Suddenly, a menacing black aura began seeping into the cave and steadily grew stronger, causing both of them to stop in surprise. Turning around, they noticed cracks spreading through the ground behind them, and it quickly became clear that the scale of the disturbance was far too large to be caused by a mere small magic stone. Vale immediately leapt upward to gain a better view, prompting Basto to ask where he was going. From his elevated position, Vale quickly realized what was happening and urgently shouted that a medium magic stone had sprouted behind them, warning Basto that they needed to run immediately. Meanwhile, back where Tyr had been left behind, Nordics had already fallen asleep, while she remained awake, quietly worrying about Basto and Vale and hoping that the two of them would return safely. Sitting there in the dim light, Tyr glanced down at the pendant hanging from her neck and softly wished that Kamang would wake up soon because there were so many things she wanted to talk about. Just then, something strange caught her attention as the ground beneath her and even the sky above seemed to begin cracking apart, a sight so sudden that it left her stunned. Panic filled her chest, and she instinctively called out for Basto, Mr. and Vale Appa, unable to hide her worry. In the very next moment, a massive explosion tore through the area, shocking Tyr even further as the violent blast shook everything around them. Nordics immediately woke up and rushed to Tyr's side, grabbing hold of her and pulling her away just before the explosion could reach her. Shielding the girl with his body, Nordics muttered that the situation clearly was not going to be an easy one to handle. Through the swirling flames and smoke, a terrifying figure soon emerged, revealing itself to be a monster. Without hesitation, Nordics began fighting it, shouting to Tyr that she needed to run while he kept the monster's attention on himself. Tyr remained frozen in shock for a moment, but Nordics urgently told her to hurry. Finally regaining her senses, Tyr scrambled to her feet and began running away. Yet as she fled, she could not stop herself from glancing back. What she saw made her heart sink as Basto, Mr. and Vale Appa both appeared injured while struggling against the monsters. Watching them fight desperately stirred something deep inside her, and a painful realization formed in her mind that Basto, Mr. might die, and Vale Appa too, and even Grandpa Nordics as well. The thought reminded her of that terrible day from her past, when everything had been lost, and the feeling that she could still do nothing to stop it crushed her heart. While running, Tears suddenly tripped and fell to the ground, tears spilling from her eyes as she cried out in desperation, begging the heavens to hear her prayer because she did not want to say goodbye to anyone ever again. As her sobbing grew louder, something unexpected happened. A mysterious green aura suddenly began emerging from her body, slowly flowing outward around her, and in the very next moment, a skeletal monster with eerie green glowing eyes appeared out of nowhere before her. At the same time, Vale was locked in combat with a monster, his expression filled with irritation as he fought back against the relentless creatures surrounding him. Nearby, Basto was also battling fiercely, but as he kicked one monster away from him, another managed to slash across his hand, leaving a painful scratch. As he steadied himself, Basto recalled that when he had scouted the cave 2 days earlier, there had only been small magic stones present, yet somehow a medium magic stone had now appeared. With that change, the situation had quickly spiraled out of control, and the two of them realized that far too many monsters were pouring out for just the pair of them to handle. The battle dragged on, and exhaustion slowly began catching up to them. Growing frustrated with the hopelessness of their situation, Vale pulled out a small bottle of poison and bitterly remarked that rather than being torn apart alive by the monsters, he would rather swallow the poison and leave the world on his own terms. However, just as he prepared himself, A bone suddenly shot through the air and smashed directly into the head of the monster attacking him. Vale froze in surprise, unable to understand what had just happened. Moments later, a skeletal arm reached forward and pulled the bone free from the monster's body, and to his shock, several skeleton monsters suddenly emerged and began fighting the surrounding creatures. The skeletons threw themselves into battle, clashing with the monsters as if they had appeared from nowhere. Watching the scene unfold, Vale could hardly believe his eyes, recalling how he had just seen them clawing their way up from the ground earlier and realizing he had not imagined it. Just then, Basto suddenly called out to him, startling Vale with the abrupt shout. Basto asked what in the world had just happened and pointed out that Vale had never mentioned being a mage. Vale, however, looked just as confused and insisted that he had assumed Basto was the one responsible for summoning the skeletons in the first place. Still holding the bottle of poison in his hand, Vale muttered that without the sudden appearance of those skeleton monsters, he would already be a dead man. Basto, however, was now deeply puzzled, wondering who could possibly be responsible if it was not Vale. The creatures that had risen from the ground were unmistakably beings of darkness, skeletons animated by power that should not normally exist. Dark attribute magic, the art of necromancy, was something that only appeared in ancient legends, spoken of but never truly witnessed. Yet now, somewhere nearby, there had to be a person capable of casting such terrifying magic for the first time in history. As the two cautiously looked around, trying to locate this mysterious figure, the faint sound of someone sniffing could suddenly be heard. Both Basto and Vale immediately became alert, wondering who the person might be, why they had intervened, and what their intentions were. In the distance, a strange green glow slowly began approaching through the darkness, and as the light drew closer, it revealed the unexpected sight of Tyr, her nose still sniffling as she wiped away the tears she had shed earlier. The girl continued walking toward them while crying, and behind her marched a group of skeletons that followed as though they were her escorts. Between sobs, Tyr called out happily to Mr. Basto and Appa Vale, relieved beyond words to see that they were alive because she had feared that everyone had already died. The two men could only stare in stunned disbelief at the unbelievable scene unfolding before their eyes. At that moment, one of the skeletons leaned closer and whispered something into Tyr's ear, informing her that Grandpa Nordix was also on his way there. Tyr brightened at the news, clearly glad to hear it, while Basto and Vale remained frozen in shock. The skeleton then warned Tyr that she might be in trouble, but Tyr quickly scolded it for saying such mean things. As she continued casually conversing with the skeletons, as if nothing was strange at all, Basto and Vale could only gape even wider, completely unable to believe the absurd situation they were witnessing. Moments later, a skeleton guided Nordix toward the others, and despite his injuries, the old man slowly made his way to Tyr, Basto, and Vale. Tyr happily pointed out that Grandpa Nordix had arrived just as her bone friends had said he would, and Basto agreed that she had been right. Tyr then explained that the bone friends had been underground the whole time, which was why they knew everything that was happening, and that they had also defeated the monsters that tried to escape. Seeing this unbelievable scene left Nordix speechless for a moment before he finally turned to Basto and Vale to check if they were safe, to which Vale replied that they were fine for now. Nordix then wondered if the skeletons had been summoned by the child, and Basto admitted that if his judgment was correct, Tyr must have been the one who summoned them, as she even seemed able to hear their voices while the others could not. What confused him, however, was that when he had first met her, there had been no sign that she possessed such an ability. Just then, Tyr asked Basto if they needed monster cores in order to pass the mercenary group exam, and when Basto confirmed that they did, Tyr quickly told them they should go because her bone friends had already gathered the cores for them. Soon after, they headed toward where the magic stone had been, and several monster cores were scattered across the ground. Vale observed the scene and noted that both the crack and the magic stone had disappeared, realizing that the skeletons had truly destroyed it without leaving anything behind. Basto noted that all the monster cores were gathered there, while Tyr happily began collecting them one by one. Seeing this, Nordix observed that the child had been born with magical power, and not just ordinary magic, but an exceptionally strong one, which surprised both Vale and Basto. He then praised Tyr for awakening her ability without even realizing it herself, though Tyr looked confused after hearing that she possessed such a power. Nordix calmly explained that most mages only awaken their abilities during their teenage years, and depending on the person, some never managed to awaken them at all, yet Tyr had somehow done it at such a young age. Before the explanation could continue further, Vale interrupted and told Tyr that she was incredible and nearly the strongest among them. Hearing those words left Tyr puzzled for a moment, as being called incredible and strong felt unfamiliar to her. However, something suddenly clicked in her mind as she remembered how her father had once told her that he was the strongest holy knight. Thinking about that memory, Tyr confidently remarked that blood was thicker than water, and the unexpected comment caused one of the nearby skeletons to burst out laughing. The three of them were puzzled by Tyr's sudden remark about blood being thicker than water. Looking around cautiously, Tyr leaned closer and quietly whispered that her dad was incredibly strong, even the strongest in the world, and that he was a powerful holy knight. Hearing the words holy knight immediately caught the attention of the others, leaving them visibly surprised. Tyr then proudly added that her own ability must have come from inheriting it from her father. Basto silently reflected on this, recalling how strange it had seemed that a child like her had been wandering alone in the forest, and he began to suspect that she might not have simply gotten lost. In this world, abilities that awakened in people generally fell into two types: holy power and magical power. Holy knights awakened holy power and channeled it through their swords, while mages awakened magical power and used it to cast different kinds of spells. The two forces existed as opposites, standing on completely different sides. For a child born to holy knight parents to awaken magical power, instead, was not entirely impossible, but it was rare enough to appear only in legends and was often viewed negatively by society. There was even an old superstition claiming that children born with powers opposite to their parents would bring ruin to their surroundings and disaster to those near them. Vale considered this carefully and realized that if the child's parents were truly the strongest holy knights, there was only one family within the empire that could hold such a title, a noble house that had produced knights with exceptionally pure holy power for generations, an aristocratic lineage that had never once fallen from its high standing. None other than House Luminen. At that moment, Basto and Vale exchanged glances, silently realizing what the situation implied. Tyr then spoke up and explained that she had not really planned to mention it, but until recently she had lived alone with her dad in a small yet cozy house. Hearing that surprised Vale, since someone from the Luminen family living in such a modest place seemed unbelievable. Tyr continued describing the house in detail, explaining that her room was only about this big, the bathroom was at the end of the hall, and during winter it became freezing cold with only icy water coming out. Yet she said she had loved it very much because even though it was just her and her dad, it had always felt like having 100 family members together. Her expression then turned sad as she explained that her dad had left, which startled both Basto and Vale. Tyr went on to say that afterward she had been alone in the forest with Kamang, and while holding up her pendant, she mentioned that Kamang was currently sleeping. Vale quickly realized that the pendant must be a permanent summon, meaning Tyr had likely awakened her power earlier without understanding it, and had unknowingly summoned something that would remain with her. Tyr then added that once Kamang woke up, he would help her find her dad. And with a bright smile, she confidently said that since they could now pass the mercenary group exam, she would definitely find him at the order. However, she quietly admitted that her dad probably would not remember her anymore, though she insisted that it was fine. That statement confused the others, and Vale wondered what kind of father could possibly forget his own daughter. Tyr reflected silently on how Kamang had used magic to rewind time, bringing them back to a moment before her father even knew her, and with tears forming in her eyes, she explained that her dad had never wanted it to happen and likely missed her too, but because of the magic she had been erased from his memories. Hearing this left the three of them deeply shocked by the cruelty of what had been done to Tyr's father. The three of them gathered together for a moment, and Vale asked if they had all just heard the same thing about Tyr being erased from her father's memory. The other two confirmed it, while Basto quietly wondered how anyone could do something so cruel to a child so young. If what Tyr said was true, then the noble and honorable Holy Knight family Luminen must have forced her father to flee with her in order to protect the child who had been born with powerful magical ability. The two of them had ended up living in a small place that was barely better than a stable, yet even it had not been tolerated by someone within the family. In the end, Tyr had been erased from her father's memories and abandoned alone in the forest, left to die or disappear without anyone knowing. Thinking about it now, while looking at the depressed little girl standing nearby, the three of them struggled to believe such a cruel story could be real. Vale, however, was already burning with anger toward the people responsible for doing such a thing to Tyr. Basto eventually spoke up and suggested that since they did not know what actions the Luminen family might take, it would be safer to hide Tyr's identity for now and carefully approach the family later. Vale agreed, reasoning that if the family had already tried to abandon her once, they would never allow her to live freely if they discovered she was still alive. Although anger still burned inside him, Basto told him to calm down because nothing could be certain yet. Vale then walked toward Tyr with a stern expression that made the girl nervous. But instead of scolding her, he simply rubbed her head and explained that there was no rule saying a 4-year-old could not join a mercenary group, though that was only because no such case had ever happened before. Tyr tilted her head and asked what the word precedent meant. So Vale simplified it by saying that no matter how strong her power might be, a 4-year-old could not officially register in a mercenary group. Still, he added that since Tyr wanted to find her father, they would simply have to find another way to make it happen. Basto agreed and explained that thanks to Tyr they were still alive, and because of that he owed her a debt he could never repay in his lifetime, so he wanted to help her in return. Nordics also agreed with Basto's words. Hearing this left Tyr surprised that they thought so highly of her, but Basto continued by saying that from now on she needed to hide her ability from other people. Tyr was confused by this and asked why, and Basto explained that her power was incredibly strong, meaning bad people might target her because of it. Vale agreed with that reasoning, adding that Tyr could end up in serious trouble before she even managed to meet her father. Hearing that made Tyr feel depressed, worried that she might never be able to find her dad. Vale then changed the topic and remarked that Tyr's power was amazing and would become a great asset to their mercenary group. But that raised the question of how they could hide her identity. He jokingly wondered if he should just carry her around or stuff her into a bag to transport her, which made Tyr loudly protest that she did not want that at all. Tyr then began thinking about how animals hid themselves, imagining cute rabbits and caterpillars hiding from lions and birds, yet she also realized that if she hid too well it might become harder for her dad to find her. As Basto also tried to think of a solution, something suddenly clicked in Tyr's mind, and she remembered the words Granny had once said to the fat man and how capable the old woman had seemed. Excited by the idea that formed, Tyr quickly called out to Mr. Basto and raised her hand, declaring that she had a really good idea, leaving the other 3 curious about what that idea might be. A few days later at the first gate of the order, the 3 men could be seen approaching while Basto carried Tyr in his arms. Tyr excitedly shared her plan, suggesting that they could simply claim she was actually a super hairy mister who had transformed into a 4-year-old, and with that story they could make her the figurehead boss of the mercenary group as repayment for the debt they owed her. With a hood covering most of her face, Tyr proudly added that she would become secretly capable. Not long after, a bag filled with magic cores was placed before the examiner, who inspected them carefully and wondered if they were Ricolops cores that only appeared from medium magic stones. Vale confirmed the details, explaining that there were 3 Ricolops, 18 Belios, and only 2 Inferno Winds, before asking if that would be enough to pass the registration exam. The examiner looked at the group suspiciously, noticing that aside from the large man, there was an old man who seemed ready to collapse, and a young woman who looked barely grown, which made him question how they had managed to obtain such cores. Suspecting they might have stolen them, he demanded to know who they were. Before he could continue, a voice sharply called him out for being rude, surprising him. Tyr, acting like an important adult leader, declared that he should show respect to the great archmage and necromancer before him. The man had to bend down just to see the small hooded figure and question what a child was doing there. At that moment, the ground suddenly cracked open and a skeleton rose from beneath it, frightening the man, while the other people nearby also panicked as more skeletons appeared, wondering who in the world had summoned them. Tyr calmly ordered her creatures to stand behind her, and the skeletons immediately obeyed, leaving the man stunned that a child could have summoned them. He then demanded that the child state her name and identity. But Basto quickly interrupted and questioned how the man dared to ask the Lord's name so casually. Tyr lightly waved her staff and told Basto to let it go, while Vale stood in the corner, barely holding back his laughter at the situation. Earlier, while Tyr had been sitting on Basto's shoulders, Vale had asked whether she could really act the part, and Tyr had confidently claimed that she could. Vale warned her not to speak like a child, and explained that a necromancer should appear calm and solemn, which made Tyr slightly nervous. He then suggested preparing lines beforehand and even wearing rougher clothes to look more convincing. Vale demonstrated how she should speak with authority when addressing holy knights and told Tyr to put strength into her voice before asking her to try it herself. Returning to the present moment, Tyr now stared at the knight with a menacing tone and asked whether he truly wished to know her name. While Vale secretly struggled to contain his laughter, Tyr encouraged herself in her mind, reminding herself that she could do it because she was the strongest in the world and a super hairy mister. With that thought, she summoned bone friend number 3, whose terrifying appearance only made the moment more dramatic, and she declared that the knight could never handle her true name and that her alias was the Necromancer King. She then asked if that introduction was sufficient, leaving the surrounding knights completely terrified of her. Soon after, the 4 finished filling out the registration forms, and a knight announced that they would now proceed with the official mercenary registration. The man soon stepped away and told them to wait for a moment. Vale felt satisfied that their plan had worked, while Basto congratulated Tyr on her acting and explained that the knight had not dared to pry into her true identity and had guided them smoothly to the registration office, clearly seeing her as a formidable figure. Nordics commented that it was fortunate everything had gone well, adding that if they had been rejected, he had been prepared to step in just to meet the minimum member requirement. He then admitted that calling this repayment still felt awkward to him and asked if he could remain with them a little longer. Vale responded that having more people would only benefit them, and Nordics expressed his relief, stating that he still needed to repay the Necromancer King for saving his life. Turning toward Tyr, Nordics explained that the Holy Knights would soon ask for the mercenary group's name and asked if she had already thought of one. Basto and Vale suddenly realized the same issue, while Tyr, surprised, admitted that she had been so focused on acting like the Necromancer King that she had not considered it. As she thought carefully, Tyr suggested naming the group the Quail Class, which made Vale nearly shout in protest. At that moment, however, a knight approached, and Vale quickly returned to his act, respectfully addressing Tyr as the Necromancer King and claiming that she objected to the proposed name. The knight then informed them that their mercenary identification number had already been issued and that under the Necromancer King's special notes, it was written that she was a dark attribute mage, before asking if there was any particular problem. Tyr remained silent as the knight began asking whether he could request additional information about the Necromancer King. She remembered the earlier discussion she had with Basto, where he explained that if anyone tried to extract information beyond what they had prepared, she was under no obligation to answer. Tyr had been surprised to hear that, but Basto confirmed it and explained that the Empire was currently relying heavily on mercenaries to destroy magic stones, making it fair to say that the Empire's survival depended on them. So the authorities were not in a position to forcibly demand information that a mercenary wished to keep secret. Vale had agreed, adding that many mercenaries often hid or even forged their identities, and if someone pressed too much, they could simply claim they were concealing their identity for safety, which had greatly excited Tyr at the time. Back in the present, Tyr addressed the knight and reminded him that her alias was the Necromancer King, questioning why he thought she appeared the way she did, and as she spoke, several more skeletons emerged from the ground. The knight quickly realized his mistake and hurriedly apologized, asking for her mercy, which secretly made Tyr happy that her act had worked. However, the knight then added that there was an unfortunate issue, explaining that an order from above stated they could not issue an identification number to Basto Ferrix. Basto was immediately shocked, and the others were just as stunned. The knight continued by saying that the order came from a report submitted by the leader of the Death Hound, Karl Warben, who had accused Basto of committing illegal acts within the mercenary group before fleeing after extorting large amounts of money and goods. Basto was completely stunned to hear himself accused of theft and quickly demanded to know what illegal acts he had supposedly committed, but the knight admitted that he did not know the details either. The knight then explained that according to the higher authorities, Basto had committed inappropriate acts serious enough that he could no longer continue his activities as a mercenary. Hearing this, Basto slammed his hand on the table in anger and insisted that Karl had been the one responsible for those crimes. He argued that it had been suspicious from the very beginning that his identification number was revoked without any proper verification process, and he demanded to know whether this kind of treatment was truly acceptable. Basto angrily called out Karl's name, questioning whether taking away his chance to protect his family was still not enough for him. Nordics felt sympathy for Basto, while Vale bitterly wondered which powerful figure the mercenary leader Karl had attached himself to and how much bribe money had been handed to the knights for this outcome, though the knight remained silent. Tyr quietly thought about the word bribery, remembering a television show she once watched with her grandmother, an aunt where a man had been caught taking bribes. She recalled them commenting that people these days gave money in strange ways, often hiding it inside luxury bags. And from that memory, Tyr concluded that bribery meant putting money in bags to control people and make them act as one wished. Returning to the present, Tyr grew worried as she realized that Carl must have bribed someone and was now tormenting Mr. Basto. The knight then admitted that although he technically should not say more, he was already aware of Basto's situation. Hearing this, Basto demanded to know why they were doing this to him. And the knight replied that the reason was simple because the person Carl had bribed was not someone easy to oppose. The knight then asked whether they had heard about the commander who had been newly appointed, and Vale questioned if it was the one personally chosen by the emperor, to which the knight nodded. Holding the registration paper, the knight explained that even among the knights, there had been plenty of talk about the man, as the commander interfered far too excessively with troop affairs in situations like this. Vale responded that even if people talked about it, it would not change anything since those kinds of people would never actually be removed from power. The knight agreed, but said that was exactly the problem, adding that although he did not know the exact details, seeing how the commander was blocking new registrations like this made it clear that he must have received a very large sum. Basto bitterly concluded that in the end the knight was simply saying they needed money, while Vale laughed at how ridiculous the entire situation was. Basto then realized that he had no money left because Carl had already taken all of the reward funds, and a wave of anger and despair filled him as he reflected that he had believed the mercenary life was his only path to avenge his family. Yet even that path now seemed closed. Basto then turned to Vale and told him to escort their leader into the order while he stayed behind to find some solution and join them later. But at that very moment, Tyr suddenly shouted and asked how much Carl had given the knights, leaving the knight visibly surprised by her question. Tyr slammed her staff and hand onto the table and demanded again to know how much that Carl, whom she angrily declared worse than a dog, had given them, leaving Vale shocked to hear such words from her. The knight hesitated, but admitted that he did not know the exact amount, only that he had heard a chest full of banknotes had been delivered. With a determined look, Tyr climbed onto the table and told herself that she would offer something even better than banknotes. She then opened her bag and began pouring out all the magic ores inside, gifts that had been gathered earlier by her bone friends. Back during their first meeting in the forest, Tyr had been crying and telling the skeletons that it was not the time to receive such things because she needed to help her friends first, promising she would accept the magic ores later. Now, in the present, she decided this was the perfect moment and continued pouring the ores out across the table while boldly declaring that the great Archmage, the Necromancer King, would provide even more. She scolded them for selling their conscience for measly banknotes hidden inside an apple box and proudly stated that she was not like such petty people, openly offering luxury goods instead. Everyone present was stunned by what Tyr had just done. About an hour later, the knight returned and handed Basto his new identification number, leaving Basto shocked that the plan had actually succeeded. The knight then informed them that since the registration had been completed, they now needed to write down the name of their mercenary group. And Tyr began thinking carefully, while Vale nervously worried that she might still choose the name Quail Class. At that moment, Tyr finally spoke and declared that the group's name would be Agaverd, surprising Vale since it was far better than he had expected. While Nordics asked how she had come up with such a name, and Tyr casually replied that she had simply made it up. In truth, while they had been waiting earlier, Tyr had looked at the large board of names and chosen the one written in the biggest letters, secretly rearranging the letters of Travaga backward to form the new name. The knight then wished the Necromancer King success in the future, and Tyr became excited, realizing that everything had succeeded and that they had officially become a mercenary group, meaning they could now go to the order. A short while later, as they walked outside with several knights watching them, Basto spoke up and sincerely thanked Tyr, repeating how grateful he truly was for what she had done. Tyr was surprised to see Bastos' eyes turning red as if he might start crying, and she quietly thought that just like her dad had once helped Basto in the past, she had now helped him as well. Vale quickly reminded Tyr not to relax her expression yet, which made her suddenly remember her act. Maintaining her composure, Tyr then announced that once they returned to the inn they should celebrate by eating something delicious, and Basto responded with a warm smile as he addressed her as the Necromancer King and agreed. While deep in his mind, he silently promised himself that he would definitely find Tyr's father for her. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the order in the port town known as Pearl City, a large ship could be seen in the background when a red-haired woman rushed in excitedly, announcing that she had huge news. She quickly called out to her leader who had been sleeping and declared that they had hit a huge jackpot. She began explaining that a newly formed mercenary group had just passed through the gate, but before she could continue, the leader lazily called out her name, Livia, a member of the mercenary group Travaga, and assumed it was the same kind of story as always. Livia grew irritated by his reaction, while a blue-haired man spoke up and told her that rookie mercenary groups forming at the registration office was nothing unusual these days, and asked if she really had to interrupt the leader's rest with such trivial news. At that moment, the man who had been sleeping finally sat up, revealing himself to be Tessiton Veronio, the leader of the mercenary group Travaga. Livia immediately snapped back, asking why Victor, the blue-haired man who was also part of Travaga, was picking a fight again, adding that if he did not want to hear it, then he could simply cover his ears. Victor replied with annoyance that it was probably useless information anyway. As the two continued arguing, another voice suddenly interrupted them and told Victor to listen because Livia was right, since something unusual had appeared this time. Tessiton turned toward the speaker, and Aelric, another member of Travaga, stepped forward and informed him that a powerful mage had appeared. The others reacted with surprise and asked if he meant that a mage had just formed a mercenary group, while Victor thought to himself that mages had become extremely rare in Talokium, since one not only had to be born with magical power as an innate talent, but also needed long training to reach such a level. For that reason, all mages were often referred to as monsters, just like Aelric, who was also a mage himself. Aelric continued explaining that the attribute of this newly appeared mage was an unusual one because it was darkness. He admitted he could not confirm everything with absolute certainty, but according to the reports, the mage had summoned a horde of skeletons right at the registration office, which meant the rumor was most likely true. The crowd reacted with shock upon hearing that someone had performed necromancy, since it was a type of magic they had only known about in theory, and the idea that it truly existed left them stunned. Tessiton calmly asked Aelric whether this information had been properly verified, and Aelric replied that he had dug through the Holy Knight's communication network to obtain it, making the report reliable. Livia proudly added that everyone had believed all remaining mages had already been recruited by top-rank mercenary corps, yet now one had suddenly appeared and even formed a mercenary group as its captain. Looking smug, Livia reminded Victor that this was the big news she had been trying to deliver earlier, leaving Victor unable to argue, since she was clearly right. Aelric further commented that because there had never been a case of a mage directly forming a mercenary group before, this person must either be a remarkable oddball or someone incredibly confident. Tessiton examined the report with interest and smiled, remarking that the new group must either be unbelievably confident in their abilities or genuinely that strong. As he looked over the listed members, he noticed the group name Ogavert and names such as Nordics and Vale, which meant nothing to him, but when he saw Basto Ferrix, he recognized him as the former vice-captain from Deathhound. Tessiton then searched further for the name of the Necromancer mage, but despite scanning the papers, he could not find it anywhere, and the realization made him suddenly burst out laughing. Covering his face while laughing, Tessiton wondered if the mage was deliberately hiding his true identity, which only made him more interested after reading that the mage had supposedly transformed into the form of a 4-year-old child while operating under the alias Necromancer King. The surrounding crowd also burst into laughter, joking that the mage had probably invented the dramatic alias himself and calling the mysterious figure completely insane. Tessiton then pointed toward the second strongest mercenary group and commented that they should start getting nervous now or they might soon fall behind this creepy mage. The remark immediately angered the man he had pointed at, a figure known as Reaper, the leader of the mercenary group Grim Reaper, who snapped back that Tessiton should stop saying such ridiculous things and that Tessiton himself should be the one getting nervous instead. Reaper warned him not to act so arrogant just because he currently held first place, reminding him that no one could know how long such glory would last, though deep down he knew that ever since Tessiton had founded Travaga and appeared in the rankings, he had never once fallen from the top position. Tessiton simply laughed and replied that Reaper was an amusing person before standing up and asking if Reaper truly believed he could take first place if Tessiton ever slipped. Reaper grew furious at the mocking tone, but Tessiton continued teasing him, saying that mindlessly training his body alone would never make Reaper number one, and that he needed to use his head as well. As the members of Travaga began walking away, Tessiton casually added that if Reaper kept being so annoying, he would make sure not to leave a single magic stone for Reaper's group to attack from now on. In that moment, as the group disappeared from sight, Reaper stood up, his face twisted in anger, and muttered that he absolutely could not stand Tessiton. Meanwhile, outside the first gate at the gate inn, Tyr, looking as cute as ever, was happily munching on cookies, remarking that the sunlight was warm and that the cookies Granny had baked were absolutely delicious. As Tyr enjoyed her snack, Vale, referring to her as the Necromancer King, asked if the cookies tasted as great as they looked, which made Tyr blink in surprise at being called that. Vale then questioned if there was any other Necromancer King besides her, and Tyr, blushing furiously at being addressed that way, replied that when it was just the two of them, he could simply call her Tyr. Feeling a swell of pride at the title, Tyr thought about how much she liked it, while Vale couldn't help but chuckle at her reaction. He teased her, poking her soft cheeks and asking if she truly liked the name Necromancer King so much, to which Tyr confidently said of course, explaining that the strongest characters always had nicknames. She even recalled her Quail-class friend Hyunwoo, who had become legendary in a game, known as Super King God General Strong. Tyr added that normally she was just Tyr, but with her skin on, she was Necromancer King Asura. Vale, utterly confused, admitted he had no idea what she was talking about, prompting Tyr to narrow her eyes and ask if he was dumb. At that moment, the two of them heard footsteps approaching. A moment later, none other than Mr. Basto and Grandpa Nordics appeared. Basto had several cloaks draped over his shoulders, and as he walked closer, he asked Tyr if she was getting along well with Vale. Tyr's attention, however, was immediately drawn to the cloaks. Curious, she asked Mr. Basto if they belonged to the Overpowered mercenary group. Basto confirmed with a nod, and then spread one of the cloaks out in front of her. The moment Tyr saw it, her eyes lit up with excitement. The cloak looked amazing, and she excitedly said that they were all cool. But more than anything, she was especially impressed by the character printed on it, Tonopang. She happily added that Tonopang was really pretty. Vale, however, looked at the design with visible surprise and bluntly asked if they had really put that pink bug on the cloak. Tyr immediately froze in shock the moment she heard Tonopang being called a bug. Basto quickly stepped in and explained to Vale that there had been certain circumstances behind choosing Tyr as their leader, which meant her identity could not be revealed. But regardless of that, as long as Tyr was the leader, they could not simply ignore her decisions. Vale, however, shrugged and casually replied that they could have at least put something cool on the cloak instead of pink bug. Hearing him call Tonopang a pink bug again made Tyr freeze in disbelief. Looking both shocked and offended, she asked how Vale Appa could possibly say something like that. Grandpa Nordics then spoke up, reminding Vale that Tyr had worked very hard on that design and that the two of them had spent a long time drawing Tonopang together. Vale, however, seemed completely unconvinced. He calmly took out a bottle of ink and declared that he was going to erase that pink bug from his cloak. Tyr was utterly stunned by what she heard, and before he could do anything, she suddenly grabbed his hand and started biting it in anger, shouting at him not to insult Tonopang. Vale looked down at Tyr in confusion and asked what she was doing. Irritated, he shook his hand slightly and complained that there was drool all over it, asking if she was a child or some kind of dog. Vale then shouted in frustration, declaring that whether Tyr was a child or a dog, he was still going to do what he had to do. Tyr, however, refused to let go and continued clutching Vale Appa's clothes, desperately telling him not to do it. Just then, the bottle of ink Vale had been holding slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Vale suddenly paused in surprise when he noticed that his hand was bleeding. At that exact moment, Kamang appeared with an angry expression, scolding them as he said he had told them to get up quickly and questioning if this was the kind of insubordination they were going to show him. Tyr immediately looked worried when she noticed Vale's injury, while Basto and Nordics were also taken aback by what had happened. Meanwhile, Kamang stood there looking irritated, casually licking his hands. Vale then called out to Tyr and, with an annoyed expression, asked if she had used her summon to attack him. Tyr quickly denied it, admitting that she had not done anything like that. Basto then handed Vale a towel and told him not to interrogate Tyr. He explained that Tyr had only recently awakened her powers, so controlling them would naturally be difficult. Although Vale understood that this was likely the case, he was still visibly angry. Basto then placed a hand on Vale's shoulder and warned him not to do something he might regret, reminding him that he would end up losing if he pushed things further. At that moment, Kamang suddenly let out a small giggle. Seeing the creature that had just endured him laughing like that only made Vale even more furious. Before the situation could escalate, however, Tyr quickly grabbed hold of Kamang and pleaded with everyone not to fight, firmly declaring that she could not forgive this either. At that moment, Tyr called out Kamang's name and told him to come with her to the truth room. They soon arrived at the inn's second-floor room, what Tyr called the truth room. Standing there, Tyr recalled one of the most important rules from Hanbit kindergarten. Friends should never hurt one another. She explained that if someone hurt a friend by accident, they would receive one sad sticker and then be allowed to leave the truth room. However, if someone hurt another person on purpose, that was a completely different matter. With a furious expression, Tyr scolded Kamang, telling him that he should never have hurt Veil Appa. Kamang, however, simply let out a lazy yawn. A moment later, he casually lay down on the floor and began to fall asleep, completely ignoring Tyr's lecture. Tyr immediately bent down and asked him why he was lying there when she was clearly scolding him. Kamang lazily replied that it was his choice. Hearing that left Tyr stunned, because whenever someone was scolded, they were supposed to apologize. Trying to remain firm, Tyr told him that no matter the situation, he should never hurt other people. Kamang, however, calmly pointed out that Tyr had bitten Veil as well. Tyr instantly fell silent, realizing that what Kamang said was true. Embarrassed, she began making excuses, saying that she had not bitten Veil Appa that hard. But Kamang suddenly changed the subject. Instead, he told Tyr that she had done well. He admitted that he had not expected her to manage so much on her own, and that from biting that guy to making it all the way to the gate, she had done a good job. Tyr looked surprised by the sudden praise. Kamang then added that the truly pathetic one was him, saying that going into hibernation for so long, just because he turned back time for a short while, was embarrassing. Tyr quickly shook her head and denied what he said, insisting that what Kamang had done was actually very difficult. Kamang then explained that it was not because he had used a great amount of power, but simply because he himself was weak. Because of that, he told Tyr that she should continue doing what she had been doing so far. He added that it was better for her to keep her true identity hidden and continue being known as the Necromancer King, while he would also remain hidden in the process. Tyr tilted her head in confusion and asked why Kamang also needed to hide his identity. Kamang replied that Tyr's companions seemed to believe he was nothing more than a permanent summon, so it would be easier to just leave things that way. Hearing that, Tyr wondered if Kamang also had his own reasons for hiding who he really was, just like she did. Feeling happy that they seemed to share something in common, Tyr cheerfully said that in situations like this, they should protect each other. She even promised that she would not tell anyone that Kamang was actually a legendary puppetmon. However, Kamang suddenly interrupted her and calmly revealed that his real name was Lucario. As he said this, his body shifted and he returned to his human form. Hearing that name, Tyr quietly thought to herself how grateful she was to have met Lucario, the one who had given her the chance to meet her daddy again. Overcome with emotion, she suddenly hugged him tightly and thanked him for helping her so much. Lucario looked completely surprised by the sudden embrace, but just as he was about to say something, Tyr quickly pulled away. Embarrassed, she muttered that her nose was running and began wiping it. She then mentioned that they would be entering the order tomorrow, and when she finally found her daddy, she would definitely repay Lucario for all the kindness he had shown her. Tyr then added that whenever Lucario felt tired, he could rest inside the bag whenever he wanted. Since they still had to hide his true identity, she said it would be better to keep calling him Kamang for now. Lucario clearly did not feel very pleased about the name, but he had little choice other than to accept it. At that moment, Tyr grabbed Lucario's hand and told him they should go, explaining that they still needed to apologize to Veil Appa. As they began to walk back, something suddenly clicked in Lucario's mind. He quietly realized that his earlier suspicion had been correct. The power that had awakened him that day had come from Tyr. He even remembered hearing her crying at that time, and thinking back on it now, Lucario knew that he had to do something to help her. As the two of them returned, Tyr cheerfully called out to Veil Appa, announcing that Kamang had come to apologize. However, Tyr failed to notice that Kamang had already turned back into the pendant. Veil, Basto, and Nordics all looked confused when Tyr said this. Veil raised an eyebrow and sarcastically asked who exactly was supposed to apologize, since he did not see any mouth capable of apologizing to him. Only then did Tyr realize what had happened, and she looked surprised as she wondered when Kamang had turned back into a pendant. Veil then sighed and said that it was fine, adding that he would just accept the apology before his finger ended up getting bitten off again. Hearing that made Tyr brighten up immediately. She happily hugged Veil Appa and asked if that meant he was no longer going to erase Tonopang from the cloak. Veil, clearly troubled by her sudden affection, asked why Tyr was acting like this and told her to get away from him. The next day, Basto gently patted Tyr on the shoulder and asked if she was ready. He reminded her that from the moment they left, she would once again have to act as the Necromancer King. Tyr confidently replied that they could leave everything to her. Soon after, the group finally departed for the Order. Along the way, Tyr thought to herself that she had imagined the place beyond the Order's gate would have large buildings like the ones in Zhongnyogu. However, just as Kamang had said, the Order was far bigger than she had expected. As soon as they passed through the gate, Tyr was greeted by scenery she had only ever seen on television before. Now, for the first time, she was actually walking into Talokium. Vale then spoke up, saying that he understood they needed to go to the Populosa Weapon District to repair Basto's hammer, but he wondered if it would not be better to head back and rent a carriage instead. Basto, meanwhile, carefully added just the cloth covering Tyr's face and replied that it could not be helped. If they wanted to save money for the journey until they reached the center of the Order, walking was the only option. Vale nodded in agreement and added that they had already spent every last coin they had because of the bribe. A moment later, Vale changed the subject and remarked that even though the strange scenery was the result of the magic stones that had sprouted a few years ago, the area still felt incredibly desolate. As he looked over at Grandpa Nordix, Vale also commented in amazement that the old man seemed to have far better stamina than he did. Not long after, Vale noticed that Tyr, who had been full of energy just moments earlier, had now fallen asleep. Basto, who was carrying her, explained that it was actually easier for them to move while Tyr was sleeping. Tyr had only fallen asleep for a short while, but during that brief moment she dreamed of the past, of the days when she and her father were still together. In the dream, the two of them were sitting side by side. Suddenly, Tyr's father told her that coming to this place had actually been an accident. Hearing that, Tyr looked confused and asked what he meant by that. Her father then explained that even now, he still did not know exactly what had happened or how it happened. However, he believed that if they kept searching, they would eventually find a way to return home. With a determined expression, Tyr looked at her father and said that they would definitely go back home. Her father then pulled her into a warm hug and reassured her that they would return home together. Even in the dream, Tyr's father looked exactly as she remembered him, never saying a single word about how hard things must have been and only smiling gently. Yet Tyr could not help but think that suddenly falling into a strange and unfamiliar world one day must have been terrifying and lonely for him. She thought about how, if she had not met Mr. Basto by chance, she might still be wandering through the forest alone, and thanks to her father telling her stories about this world every day, even though the place was unfamiliar, remembering those stories always made her feel a little more reassured. Thinking about her father now, Tyr quietly realized how difficult everything must have been for him. And while still asleep, she softly murmured for him to wait a little longer, promising that this time she would definitely be the one to protect him. 2 days later, the group arrived at Pearl City, a port city located on the outskirts of the Order, and as Nordix looked around at the surroundings, he commented that the place was still the same as he remembered it. Vale, who was breathing heavily from exhaustion, asked Nordix if he really was 60 years old, since the old man seemed to have far better stamina than he did, but Nordix simply asked if they wanted to look around the city. Basto, however, suggested that they should first secure an inn and properly settle down, explaining that it would take about a week to reach the Populosa Weapon District from there. Hearing this, Nordix recommended the Red Glove Inn, explaining that it was the only place in the area that accepted credit, and because of that the inn was always crowded with mercenaries, making it the perfect place to investigate information about the child's parents while they stayed there. Not long after, they arrived at the Red Glove Inn, and Nordix said he would go check if there were any rooms available, telling the others to wait for a moment. Vale then asked if Tyr was still sleeping, and Basto replied that it was only natural for her to be tired after such a long journey. Thinking back on their travels, he remembered how Tyr had struggled while walking such long distances, yet she had still helped him when he got trapped in a sandpit and had endured camping out in the wilderness with them, which must have been incredibly difficult for a 4-year-old child. Right at that moment, Vale covered Tyr with a black cloth and said that there were many mercenaries around, so they should not let everyone see that the strongest necromancer was sleeping so soundly, adding that their dignity would drop if Tyr was seen like that. Basto then remarked that Nordix was taking quite a while, and Vale suggested that they should go inside and check on him, to which Basto agreed. As the two walked into the inn, they overheard the receptionist explaining that one of the guests had said they would be checking out early that day, so there were no rooms available at the moment, but one would soon open up and they would just need to wait a little. Vale then asked Nordix what they were talking about, while the receptionist added that the guest would definitely check out around that time, since they were planning to take the morning boat to the order. Just then, a voice called out to the receptionist, whose name was Rudy, and Rudy replied that Tessiton had finally come out. Vale was immediately surprised when he heard that name, as Tessiton was from Travaga and ranked first among the mercenary groups. Tessiton casually spoke with Rudy, commenting that business seemed to be doing quite well, and Rudy replied that it was only a brief peak season. Tessiton then yawned and slowly walked down the stairs, and as Vale looked at him, he thought to himself that a monster truly was a monster, because even just standing in front of Tessiton created an overwhelming pressure. At that moment, something caught Tessiton's attention. It was the child covered in a black cloth who was being carried by Basto. Just as Tessiton was about to ask if the child was the famous necromancer, Livia suddenly appeared and interrupted, telling him that the boat was about to leave and that he should hurry. Because of that, Tessiton left without saying anything to Basto or the others. As the door closed behind him, Basto remarked that Tessiton had an incredible presence, and Nordics added that he had heard Tessiton used a very strange style of swordsmanship. Vale agreed, saying that the swordsmanship felt both noble and vulgar at the same time, and he wondered if such a strange style could really exist. Rudy, hearing those rumors, commented that it made sense such talk would follow someone like Tessiton, and Basto then asked Rudy if he knew the details behind those stories. Rudy, however, replied that he could not disclose such information or he would lose a regular customer. So he quickly changed the topic and told them that a room had just become available for them. At that moment, Tyr was dreaming about her father again, hearing his voice as if he were speaking to her, and the dream her father was the guest while Tyr herself was the innkeeper. Soon after, Tyr suddenly woke up and wondered if what she had just seen had only been a dream. She sat up abruptly and asked where she was, and Vale replied that it was actually the perfect time for her to wake up, since if she slept any longer, she would not be able to sleep at night. Nordics then explained that they had arrived at Pearl City and were currently staying at an inn. The three of them then told Tyr that they had some business to take care of, asking her to wait quietly in the room for a while, and Tyr obediently replied that she would stay there quietly. After leaving Tyr alone, Basto told the other two that it was time for them to go downstairs and gather some information, especially to see if anyone knew about the Luminen family or the whereabouts of Kim Young-soo. Meanwhile, Tyr stood by the window and quietly stared outside, saying to herself that it was just like her father had once described, and that Talokium was truly beautiful. She marveled at how, after crossing the endless desert, there was now such a vast ocean before her, and she repeated one of the sayings her father had once told her, that men were ships and women were ports. Downstairs, Nordics could be seen asking around for information about a man named Kim Young-soo, but the effort seemed useless. Just then, from a corner of the room, a familiar face who knew Basto suddenly shouted at him in anger, demanding to know how Basto dared to ask about the Holy Knights when he had not shown his face to the man for ages. Basto, however, remained completely silent. Vale, on the other hand, told the man to stop yelling and added that if he did not know anything, he should just stay quiet instead of acting all high and mighty. The man immediately asked Vale who he was, saying he had never seen him around before, but Vale calmly replied that he had met plenty of people like him. People who acted like they knew everything even though they actually knew nothing at all. Hearing that only made the man angrier, and after taking a large gulp of beer, he told Vale and Basto to sit down, declaring that he would tell them everything he knew about the Luminen family just to prove that he was not bluffing. Meanwhile, upstairs in the room, Tyr was still staring out the window when she suddenly spotted Tessiton walking down the street together with Livia. The moment Tyr saw Tessiton, she wondered if she was still dreaming about her father, because the man she was looking at seemed to resemble him so much. Suddenly, Tyr rushed down the stairs after quickly putting on her cloak, and she ran outside, chasing after the man she believed to be her father. Then she stopped in the middle of the street and stared ahead, and Tyr's eyes suddenly lit up because the man she had seen was not just someone who looked like her father. It was actually her father himself. Meanwhile, back inside the inn, the angry man continued explaining about the Luminen family, saying it was a family filled with those known as the Empire's strongest holy knights. He added that the head of the family, Valentia Luminen, had 4 sons, and each of them held an important position among the holy knights, making them incredibly influential figures. The first son, Edmund Luminen, served as a tactical advisor. The second son, Leonardo Luminen, was a division commander, and the third son, Alexander Luminen, worked as a chief medical officer. Hearing this, Vale casually remarked that he already knew all of that, and then he pointed at the man while telling Basto that the guy clearly did not know anything since he was only repeating the most basic information. The man, however, said that he was not finished yet and explained that while the three sons were all well-known figures, no one actually knew the whereabouts of the Luminen family's fourth son. Hearing that made Vale curious, and he asked the man if by any chance the fourth son had a child who was about 4 years old. Basto then added another possibility, asking if the fourth son might have married against the family's wishes, had a child, and then run away. The man looked confused by their questions and asked what they were talking about, explaining that the youngest son of the Luminen family had only just become an adult the previous year, so the idea of him having a 4-year-old child made no sense at all. Meanwhile, outside in the city, Tyr could be seen running desperately toward the man she believed to be her father, Tessiton, while Tessiton himself was heading out to sea and was already on a boat. Tyr ran as fast as she could without paying attention to where she was going, and because of that she accidentally slammed into a suitcase that had been left in her path. Back inside the inn, Basto and Vale asked the man if any of the other young masters of the family had children, but the man replied that if that were the case, everyone would already know about it. Vale nodded and admitted that the man was right, and after thinking carefully for a moment, he concluded that there could only be one possibility. Meanwhile, back outside, Tyr clutched her head in pain after the collision, but she refused to let it stop her. She quickly stood up again, telling herself that she had come all this way to meet her dad, and with tears filling her eyes, she shouted out for him again and again. Hearing the cries, Tessiton finally turned around and wondered why a small, adorable child was crying while calling for her father. As their eyes met, Tyr remembered the warm smile her father used to give her, and at that moment she smiled as well. But that was far from the truth, because at that moment Tessiton immediately turned away, leaving Tyr standing there alone as he slowly disappeared from her sight. Tyr could only stand there crying loudly as the father she loved did not recognize her at all. Meanwhile, back inside the inn, Vale asked the man if there was any possibility that the head of the Luminen family, Valentia Luminen, might have had a child with someone else later in life. The man immediately denied it, saying that such a thing was impossible and that everyone in the Empire knew Valentia Luminen had loved the Saint of Richard with his entire body and soul for his whole life. Basto quietly thought to himself about Eleonora, Valentia Luminen's wife and the Saint of Richard, a woman said to possess the most powerful holy power in history. The love story between Valentia Luminen and Eleonora was famous throughout the Empire, and with 4 children between them, it was easy to assume that their marriage had been genuinely harmonious. Vale, however, looked irritated and argued that nobody truly knew what happened between a married couple, sarcastically asking why people thought there were so many requests to poison unfaithful husbands. From the outside, couples might appear close and harmonious, smiling and walking arm in arm as if everything was perfect, but Vale said he had seen enough noble bastards secretly plotting to kill each other behind the scenes to know better. He then added that if the head of the family really did have an illegitimate child somewhere, it could even explain the strange incident that had happened to Saint Eleonora. Just then, Nordics rushed over looking worried and called out to them, urgently telling Basto and Vale that their leader, Tyr, had suddenly disappeared. Hearing that, both Basto and Vale were immediately shocked. Wasting no time, the 3 of them immediately rushed outside to search for Tyr, panicking as they looked around the area. At that moment, Nordics managed to gather some information and told the other 2 that someone had seen a small child walking alone toward the dock. Hearing that made Basto deeply regret leaving Tyr alone in the room. Vale immediately broke into a run and shouted for the others to hurry. As he ran, Vale kept trying to convince himself that Tyr would be fine since she was a smart child, but deep down he was filled with regret, blaming himself for doing something so foolish, leaving a 4-year-old child alone, and he silently prayed that nothing bad had happened to her. After a few minutes, the 3 of them finally reached the dock, and there they saw a small child lying motionless on the ground. The sight immediately terrified them, and they rushed toward her, calling out Tyr's name in worry. Meanwhile, as Tyr lay on the ground, she quietly thought to herself that she finally understood what Kamang had meant. She had believed that if she could just meet her dad again, she would be able to explain everything and that everything would be fine as long as he was alive. But now she realized the painful truth: her dad had forgotten about her. That meant he might even find her annoying or say that she was not needed anymore. As those thoughts filled her mind, Tyr began remembering all the precious memories she had shared with her father, realizing that those memories had now been forgotten by him. Covering her face, she was soon picked up by the three worried adults, and as Tyr realized that things could never return to how they once were with her dad, she began crying loudly. Moments later, Vale opened the door and complained that the situation was driving him crazy, saying that the kid clearly was not in the right state of mind since Tyr's voice had become completely hoarse from crying and repeatedly calling for her dad. Basto immediately told Vale to lower his voice, adding that it was already depressing enough seeing Tyr in such a state. Vale, however, sounded somewhat irritated and remarked that it was ridiculous for someone called the Necromancer King to be whining about her father like that. A little while later, Nordics asked the two of them if they had managed to find any useful information, but Vale replied that everything he heard was just unimportant gossip. Basto then mentioned that although the head of the Luminen family was not too old to have another child, there was something about the situation that kept bothering him. Tyr had clearly said that she had lived only with her father, but the problem was that Duke Luminen had never missed any official events. Valentia Luminen was still actively participating in battles involving magic stone outbreaks, and whenever sieges dragged on, he would camp for months while constantly traveling between battlefields. Vale then added that Tyr had also claimed her father was under some kind of oblivion magic that caused him to forget his own child, but Vale questioned who in the entire empire would dare tamper with the memories of the head of the Luminen family. The three of them grew increasingly confused by the situation they were facing, and after thinking for a moment, Nordic suggested that perhaps they should not blindly trust the idea that the child's father was the strongest holy knight. Vale agreed with that assessment. Nordics then explained that while the child was clearly clever and probably not lying, it was also true that they were missing several crucial clues. So he suggested that once Tyr calmed down a little, they should carefully ask her more specific questions about her father. Basto remained silent at that moment, remembering how Tyr had been crying in his arms earlier. Then Vale suddenly spoke up and asked the two of them what would happen to Agavert if Tyr eventually found her father. Meanwhile, in the next scene, the atmosphere became tense as Tessiton's voice could be heard telling Livia to protect Tyr. Hearing her father's voice, Tyr looked surprised, but she soon realized that she could not move her body at all. At that moment, Livia could be seen holding a baby while calling out to Aelric. Nearby, Aelric was fighting a powerful monster, and Tyr was shocked to see both monsters and people battling around her. Aelric shouted at Livia not to come any closer and ordered her to take the young lady, Tyr, and run. Livia hesitated for a moment, but Aelric demanded to know if she was going to let the young lady get hurt. Holding baby Tyr tightly in her arms, Livia spoke softly to reassure her, telling her not to worry at all, before quickly running away from the danger. However, after a short while, Livia suddenly fell to her knees and muttered that things were not going well and that they needed to escape from the cracks as soon as possible. Tyr wondered who this person was, but her body felt cold, leaving her unsure of what to do. Just then, Tessiton arrived and urgently called out to Livia, asking if she had been poisoned. Tyr was surprised to see her father there. Livia apologized to Tessiton, saying that she had promised to protect the young lady, but seemed she would not be able to keep that promise. Tessiton, looking worried, immediately asked if Aelric had died, and when Livia did not answer right away, he grew even more anxious. Livia, however, simply smiled and told Tessiton that it was fine and that he did not need to worry about them, insisting that he should escape together with the young miss. Livia then added that, honestly, making it that far with a team like theirs was already amazing. As she said this, she slowly reached her hand toward the young miss and said that she wanted to see the young lady grow up and walk someday. With a gentle smile, she told the young miss to grow up healthy, to laugh a lot with her dad, and to always be happy. With those final words, Livia passed away. Moments later, Tessiton was running again with his daughter held tightly in his arms, reassuring the little child that everything would be fine and that they would definitely make it out of there. However, Tyr could see that monsters were everywhere around them, which made her worried about her dad's safety. Just as Tyr called out to him, she suddenly woke up from the dream and muttered that it had been a strange dream. Tyr thought to herself that it was the first time she had ever experienced such a vivid dream, but she also began wondering if it had truly been just a dream. She then remembered how the red-haired lady had mentioned Basto, and she recalled her dad once saying that Basto was his friend. Thinking about all of this carefully, Tyr began to wonder if what she had just seen was actually something that had happened when she was still a baby. In that fragile moment, as memories of her earlier conversation with her father resurfaced, Tyr suddenly recalled his claim of being a holy knight, which only deepened her confusion about why the woman in the dream had referred to him as a leader instead. Her thoughts spiraled, and with tears welling in her eyes, she found herself overwhelmed by the realization that nothing made sense anymore, clinging to the hope she once had that simply reuniting with her father would somehow fix everything, a hope that now felt painfully misplaced. Lost in uncertainty and unsure of her next step, she stood frozen until Kamang gently intervened, extending a hand toward her while quietly acknowledging her struggle and prompting her to reflect on whether she had truly found the father she had been searching for all this time. In that moment, Tyr looked at Kamang with tears clouding her eyes and admitted that he was right, realizing with a heavy heart that her father no longer remembered her. And with that realization came the crushing loss of courage to reveal the truth about being his daughter. Overwhelmed, she turned to Kamang once more, searching for guidance as uncertainty consumed her. As Kamang pulled her into a comforting embrace in an attempt to soothe her, Tyr continued to pour out her emotions, expressing how deeply she missed her father and how strong her love for him still remained. While she cried and Kamang tried to calm her, a strange thought lingered in his mind, recalling how even in that distant world where he once slept, he could faintly hear both Tyr and that man's voice, and how her laughter brought him a quiet sense of warmth, while her tears made his chest tighten as if everything around him was falling apart. And so, seeing her like this again, he felt an urgent need to stop her sorrow, which was why he had come to this place. In that instant, Kamang called out to her and reflected on the mysterious concept of destiny's recurrence, something that left Tyr visibly confused, prompting him to explain that certain outcomes remain unchanged, and that regardless of how many times a life is relived, most people inevitably walk toward the same fate. Even then, Tyr struggled to fully grasp his meaning, but as his words settled, something suddenly clicked within her, and with a serious expression, she questioned whether her father was destined to fall into Jongnyogu once again and face the same accident. The memory of that horrifying moment surged back, causing her to clench her hands tightly as determination replaced her fear, declaring inwardly that she would prevent it from happening this time. She resolved that her father was no longer the same man as before, and if he were to return to Korea again, he would only be forced to endure the same painful hardships he had once suffered, something she could not bear to witness again, as she refused to let him suffer because of her and disappear from her life forever. In that moment, filled with renewed determination, Tyr enthusiastically declared that in her father's homeland, she would ensure he lived all the way to becoming a 100-year-old grandfather. And hearing such conviction, Kamang responded with a gentle smile, believing that if anyone could make it happen, it would be her. Just then, a voice echoed from outside, calling out with concern and asking if she had been crying, and upon recognizing it, Tyr immediately reacted to veil Appa's presence. Moments later, the three hurried into the room, their faces filled with worry as they questioned whether she had managed to eat and regain some strength, reminding her that no matter how difficult it felt, she needed to eat to recover. Soon after, Nordic stepped forward and carefully mentioned that he had something to ask, seeking her permission, which left Tyr wondering what he intended to know. Once everyone had settled, Nordic explained that to find her father, they first needed clear details about his appearance and the place they had lived together, which only deepened Tyr's confusion about why such specifics mattered. Basto then clarified that while they genuinely wanted to help her, they lacked enough information, and this realization caught Tyr off guard, making her reflect on how she had only shared her father's name so far. Gathering herself, she began speaking, drawing their full attention, though her voice carried a hint of hesitation as she revealed that she had lived with her father in Jongnyogu, a place that left the three silent at first before confusion took over, as none of them recognized it, while Tyr calmly noted that it was unfamiliar to them. Brightening up, she went on to describe the food, the people, and many other aspects of Jongnyogu, along with how her father, once a powerful holy knight, had suddenly been transported to Korea, and to support her explanation, she pointed to her bag, indicating its origin, which surprised Basto upon realizing that the crest on it was actually a form of writing. In that moment, Vale stepped forward and acknowledged that Nordic's reasoning made sense, though his tired expression revealed growing frustration as he admitted that while Tyr did not seem to be lying, the more he listened, the more tangled and confusing everything became, prompting Tyr to quickly insist that every word she had spoken was the truth. Accepting her response, Vale chose not to press further and shifted the focus, suggesting that for now, they should continue with their current plan and head to the Order to visit the Holy Knight headquarters. He then confirmed once more whether her father was truly in Zhangyogu, and Tyr responded with a firm nod, certain of his presence there while recalling that she had seen him not long ago. Calling her name again, Vale's expression turned serious as he questioned whether she intended to leave Agavert once she found her father, a thought that caught Tyr completely off guard. Not long before entering the room, the three had already discussed this possibility among themselves, with Vale pointing out that if Tyr reunited with her father, Agavert would likely fall apart, a conclusion Basto agreed with as he considered the likelihood of returning to life as a wandering mercenary, while Nordics admitted he had never truly planned to remain one and would simply go back to the gate area. After weighing everything carefully, Vale rejected that outcome, insisting that finding her father and her role as leader were separate matters, and proposed that if Tyr could not bear being apart from him, they could instead bring her father into Agavert, clarifying that he had no intention of making him work, as simply existing as a dark mage already carried legendary weight, and with Tyr remaining as a figurehead leader, they could strengthen their group, aim for the top rank, and better protect both her and her father, seeking agreement from the others. In that moment, Basto acknowledged that the idea had merit but emphasized that things were not so simple, pointing out that mercenary work was inherently dangerous and reasoning that if he were in Tyr's father's place, he would strongly oppose it, a thought Vale silently agreed with, though deep down he could not abandon Agavert and the opportunity tied to the Necromancer King, as he refused to return to a life of poverty. Back in the present, Tyr quietly set her cup down and firmly stated that she had no intention of leaving the mercenary group, while internally resolving that if she truly wanted her father to live to 100, then, as the new Necromancer King, her Agavert would have to be the ones to find and protect him. With newfound determination, she repeated her stance with confidence, declaring that she would now become independent from her father. Her words stunned Basto and Nordics, and even Vale was briefly taken aback, struggling to process the shift in her resolve. Basto questioned how things had reached this point and pressed her to explain what she meant, while Nordics wondered if this meant she would stop searching for her father altogether, prompting Tyr to quickly clarify that she had no intention of giving up the search, but that when she finally reunited with him, she would no longer cling to him or rely on him to take care of her as she once did. A statement that left Basto visibly surprised, carrying herself with a maturity that reminded her of the old woman from her previous home. Tyr further expressed through her gestures that from now on, she and her father would walk their own paths, accepting that she could not remain sheltered under his protection forever. Just as Basto was about to argue his point, Vale abruptly cut in, his expression brightening with sudden enthusiasm as he declared that Tyr was right, insisting that even at 4 years old she was old enough to stand on her own, a statement that left both Nordics and Basto visibly taken aback. Vale went on to reveal that he himself had grown up without parents since the age of 2, which shocked Tyr and stirred her curiosity, though he quickly dismissed the need for further explanation, while Basto and Nordics silently reflected on how difficult his past must have been. With a light smile, Vale continued by suggesting that if Tyr truly intended to be independent, then they should begin properly earning as mercenaries, gesturing toward the others as reassurance that whenever she needed adult support, they would be there alongside Agavert. Encouraged by his words, Tyr readily agreed and proudly affirmed her position as the Necromancer King, her motivation surging as she declared her determination to work hard moving forward, with Vale quietly supporting her from behind. He then presented her with a contract, explaining that it was a written pledge binding them together so that none of them would leave Agavert. And upon seeing it, Tyr became visibly excited at the thought of signing her very first contract. As she read through it, she noticed that leaving required the consent of all 3 adults, and while Vale guided her to where she needed to sign, Basto and Nordics exchanged puzzled looks, wondering when he had even prepared such a document. Realizing that it held no real legal power, the two ultimately chose not to argue and joined in signing it anyway, which only heightened Tyr's excitement. Watching them from behind, Vale's expression softened into a warm smile, quietly satisfied with the bond that had just been strengthened. Moments later, night fell and Tyr prepared for bed, and as everyone settled down, she quietly brought up a question, asking Basto whether he truly despised holy knights, to which he admitted his strong dislike, while Vale added that such feelings were common among mercenaries, prompting Tyr to wonder if it was because of corruption like bribery among them. With a faint smile, Vale turned the question back on her, suggesting whether her father being a holy knight was the reason behind her sudden resolve for independence. But Tyr quickly rejected that idea, holding firmly to her belief that her father was a good person. Though she wanted to say more, the words would not come, as her thoughts drifted back to the strange vision she had seen earlier, leaving her conflicted since she knew Bastos' hatred for holy knights. Yet in that memory, he had stood alongside her father, creating a contradiction she could not understand. She clearly remembered her father identifying himself as a holy knight, yet those around him had not addressed him as one, leading her to wonder if he had been working in secret under some hidden role. Brushing aside her confusion, she simply explained that her curiosity stemmed from wanting to understand Bastos' hatred, prompting him to finally reveal that it originated from the Empire's betrayal, as the imperial family had abandoned not just the mercenaries but the common people as a whole, choosing instead to protect only the nobles.